have to say, I'm so glad to have so many people with us, and some of our friends from other towns that are, that have been involved with us for so long. Ed and Janine J. Chardon, who Ed was the architect who helped me design this space, and Janine was my chair for a very long time, so very glad to have you with us. And certainly we wouldn't have this space if it hadn't been for Ed's help. But it's so good to be able to welcome Dr. Gail and Hope Schwartz. And Dr. Gail is an associate neurologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, study physician and investigator with the Center for Alzheimer Research and Treatment, also known as CART. And he's an instructor of neurology at Harvard Medical. And Hope is a program coordinator at the Center for Brain and Mind Medicine at Brigham and Women's. So really very, very glad. And Carolyn is here as outreach for them. But very glad to be able to welcome you out here. I know that's quite a trip for you to come out. And thank you so much for your willingness to be here and present this very important information. And I'm so pleased to have so many of you with us. This is our keynote speaker for our Health Education Week, which has been a fabulous week with a real focus on health education. We've had some fabulous discussions and presentations on fall prevention, on medicine management, on nutrition as well as on with our fitness programs that are ongoing. So this is a great way to wrap up our week, and we really appreciate your time.
Sure.
So I'm going to turn it right to Dr. Gail so that we can give him plenty of time to talk, and then they can take questions. I'm sure we all have things that we'd like to be able to talk with you about.
Sure.
Just to let you all know, we do have a men's room and a women's room labeled as boys and girls right across the hall on the left. And I thought, it was really kind of charming to leave those pieces in place from the school, so we've really appreciated that. And I also have coffee, and both decaf and regular, and tea, and water, and cookies, so anything that you need, just please let me know. And I'm going to turn right to you.
Sure.
And thank you again.
Sure. All right. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. So it's a pleasure to be here. We have not been to Georgetown before. It's a lovely town. On the way in, we'll spend some time on our way out as well. Couple starting questions. Who has done Tai Chi before here? Raise your hand. That's great. That's bigger. That's larger numbers than I've seen before. Who has done yoga before? Excellent. So I understand that there's yoga and Tai Chi that's going on here, which is fantastic. Who took part in other health activities as part of this week that we just heard about? Anybody else?
As part of what?
As part of, this was a health promotion week, I guess, here, where there were a lot of particular health activities. Did anyone do other activities? That's great. Good, good. I see some hands, that's great. So what we'll do, Hope and I, is we're going to talk to you about brain health from the perspective of neurology. So there's the disease aspect of it, and there's also the normal aging and brain health aspect, and both are tied, as you'll see. So I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, and I hope everyone can hear me. Just shout out if you can. I'll give a little bit of an introduction about who we are and the center that we work in and what kind of work we do there. And then I'll turn it over to Hope, who's going to talk about some of the background for the science behind brain health recommendations, why exercise and healthy eating and social and mental stimulation, why those things are important. And then how will we do this? And then towards the end, I'll come back and talk a little bit about sleep and something called cognitive reserve and medications and a couple other things. And we want to leave plenty of time for questions.
How about I dim the lights?
Maybe a little bit, sure. That would be great.
And then I can just bring it back.
So I'm gonna run through these.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better for me too. That's great.
You could do more.
I think that's good. It's easier to look out when there's less light.
Precise.
So I'm gonna run through a little bit. So who are we and what is CART and CBMM? We're gonna talk about, as I said, the background. So what is normal aging versus what we call dementia, and a little bit about past and future studies of what is going on right now with clinical trials and in this field. And then we're going to spend a bulk of time talking about brain healthy behaviors which is a lot of stuff that you kind of know about and you have in the back of your mind, but there are some particular recommendations that large studies have shown can be particularly beneficial. So we're going to make sure to highlight those. So we work at the Center for Brain Mind Medicine. So this is a clinic or a center within Brigham and Women's Hospital. And the folks, the specialties that in medicine that take care of or evaluate patients who have thinking or memory or behavior difficulties are from a bunch of different fields. They include someone like myself who's a neurologist. So I'm a neurologist by training, but my subspecialty in neurology is cognitive and behavioral neurology, which is additional training beyond what you get just in basic neurology. The other fields of neurology are things like epilepsy and stroke and neuro-oncology, brain tumors and things like that. So there is a subspecialty in both clinical care and in research that is particular to dementia and also to any other cognitive and behavioral disorders like attention deficit disorder, for example, is something that falls in this category. And then in that group of providers are also neuropsychologists. So these are folks who are particularly trained to interpret and help understand performance on memory testing, on thinking and writing testing that you would have done as part of an evaluation. So those are folks that are psychologists by training, but then have an additional specialty in interpreting cognitive tests. Then there are neuropsychiatrists that we work with, who are psychiatrists typically by training, but have additional expertise in helping patients who might have a neurological problem, let's say MS or Alzheimer's disease, but are suffering from significant psychiatric problems like depression or agitation or anxiety or things like that. And the mission of the center is to provide really what I think is a multidisciplinary approach. So if you were to see someone in our center, you might get evaluated by a neurologist first, but then I forgot to mention one other specialty which is extremely important, which is social work. So we have social workers in our group who, if you connected to me and were started to be treated for let's say Alzheimer's disease, we have a whole support group that's in social work that would help to connect you to services, to help caregivers with behavioral strategies, to help care for someone who has dementia. So anyway, that's the general framework from which where we come from. And the other mission of our center is research, because as many of you know, in these diseases, in dementias, in what we call neurodegenerative diseases, there aren't any effective medications yet that can change the course of decline or that can cure the disease. So that's one avenue of research, which is to try to find novel drugs and novel therapeutic strategies in general to treat Alzheimer's. The other part of the mission is early detection of cognitive changes and other biological changes that you can detect sometimes before you can actually detect the changes of something like Alzheimer's disease. So those are the two avenues. And I will put these two slides up again at the end. And before I forget to, we have a sign-up board over here for learning more about either clinical care or about research opportunities, so we can come back to that too. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hope, who's going to talk about cognitive aging, and I will be back.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Let me know if you can. I'm losing my voice a little bit, but I'm going to do my best. So as Dr. Gale said, my name is Hope Schwartz. I'm the program manager for non-pharmacological interventions for dementia in the Center for Brain Mind Medicine in the clinic where we both work. And what I mostly focus on in my work is how to get our patients to do the things that we know can help them with their memory and their thinking. And these are things that you can incorporate in your day-to-day life, like exercise and diet and certain things with medication and sleep that we'll go into detail about. And so what we want to do in this presentation is to bring all of these recommendations to you, tell you what we know, tell you a little bit about some of the background of the research studies that kind of got us to this point, how we know what we know, and then definitely just open it up for you guys to ask questions about any of these things you might be more curious about. We're going to go through, there's a lot of information here. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because I want to get to your questions. but definitely, keep questions back of mind so we can come back if there's something you want to hear more about. So first, to start out, I want to give a little bit of background about cognitive aging and what we mean when we talk about words like mild cognitive impairment or dementia. And so this graph, I think, is particularly useful to think about. So this is a graph that shows cognitive function on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. And I want you to first just take a look at this purple arrow, this dotted line here. This is our normal aging curve. And so what you can see here is that, unfortunately, for basically almost everyone in the population, as you age, as you get older, your cognitive function is going to go down a little bit. Not too much, but you can see that it's, a little bit lower here in later life than it might have been in middle age or as a younger person. And that's not a problem. That's a normal part of the aging process. But we also have, what we would consider non-normal aging, and there are a lot of causes, potential different causes for that. The most common you probably have heard of is Alzheimer's disease. And this presents with a slope that is a little bit different and a little bit more troublesome. And so, you can see that as you're aging, your cognitive function is going down really quite a bit, to the point where when you get around here in what we call dementia, you really would be unable to kind of take care of your day-to-day activities. And so we like to think about this as kind of a continuum, a spectrum, starting with what we call preclinical or subjective cognitive decline. So people who fall into that category are people who come into the clinic to get evaluated, and they might say to their neurologist or their neuropsychologist, I am having more problems with memory than I used to, or, yeah.
I'm just wondering, are there an age sort of cycle when these things start occurring and when you can expect them to get worse, roughly?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can just step in.
Yeah.
So every decade past 30, let's say, there is an expected decline on normal aging, things like multitasking and attention and things like that. The most common age for the onset of dementia is late 60s or mid 70s. Okay, so that means that the initial symptoms of what is 85% of all late life dementia is Alzheimer's disease, which means there's some that's not, which we'll get to. But that's a rough estimate. The difficulty, of course, is that there are people who have, say, the beginning of age-related cognitive decline, what seems to be that's the case in their late 60s, but they're harboring the early changes in the brain of what we know to be Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of research focuses on differentiating that decline from normal aging versus what's the beginning of like an incipient disease. But it's hard to commit to ages, because as the curve shows, there is normal decline, and someone's curve, this is an estimate, could very easily be in the middle of these two, and they could not show the changes in the brain microscopically of something like Alzheimer's, but yet they're a little bit different than normal aging. So this is all areas of ongoing research. So we'll come back to those things.
Yeah, so we can come back, and we can come back to other questions about everything we're presenting. So subjective cognitive decline is sort of your own subjective experience of your memory isn't what it used to be, you're not thinking as fast, you're having a hard time multitasking. But when you actually come into clinic and you sit down and you go through some testing with a neuropsychologist, we would see that you are normal, fall within a normal range compared to other people who are your age and who have your same educational background. And so it's important that people who are in this SCD group, they can stay on the normal aging curve, and a lot of them do. But a lot of them, or many of them, may also continue to decline into MCI or dementia. And so we know that SCD is a risk factor for dementia. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will develop it, but it means that you have a higher risk of developing it later in life.
What does MCI stand for? I don't see it.
Yep, so I'm going to go through that in the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. So the next kind of topic or vocabulary I want to give you is MCI, which is something we talk a lot about in our clinic. And these are people for whom they have both the subjective experience of cognitive decline and also on testing have some evidence that their memory or their thinking is a little bit slower or a little bit worse than it should be based on just their age and their education. And many people, again, similar to SCD, you know, some people will kind of stay in this MCI group for many years, and others may progress into dementia. So MCI is you know, a common reason that people will come seek care in a clinic like the Center for Brain Mind Medicine where we work. And then lastly, the way that we differentiate dementia. So people with dementia also have more problems with thinking and memory than normal people who are their age. But the difference we like to think about between MCI and dementia is that once people have dementia, they're no longer able to go about their day-to-day activities independently. So they may not be able to work anymore, they may not be able to manage their finances, to grocery shop, and so that's really what we would consider to be have progressed from MCI to dementia. And we know that, let's see, the last point here on this slide is that the annual rate of conversion from MCI to dementia, so these are people who are moving kind of down this curve, is about 5 to 15% per individual. So let's talk a little bit more about what we call normal cognitive aging or senior moments. So just by show of hands, how many people have like misplaced their glasses somewhere in their house and not been able to find them? Yeah, same. Or if you run into someone at a grocery store and you have seen them before and you know their name, but you just can't think of it. It doesn't come to mind off the top of your head. Anyone? Yeah, a lot of us. So a lot of these kinds of experiences are what we would call senior moments and can definitely just be a normal part of aging. And I think this is something that many people are concerned by if they start having these lapses in memory or they feel more frequent than they used to be. They can definitely be concerning. It doesn't necessarily mean your prognosis is ultimately dementia or you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but if they're frequent and if they're bothering you, they might be a reason to talk to a neurologist or a psychologist who can do a little bit more detailed testing and help you figure out if you're just having normal age-related decline or if there's something else going on that we can help treat. And there are a lot of things that can contribute to memory problems, especially later in life, that aren't necessarily neurodegenerative disorders. So these can be, we'll talk a little bit more about medications, prescription or over-the-counter that might have an effect on your memory, things like head trauma, certain psychiatric disorders like anxiety or depression, alcohol, substance use. There's a bunch up here that if you were to come in for an evaluation, we would talk through all of these things and try to tease apart what's going on. And on some level, we can sort of tell what's concerning and what might be more of a harmless kind of normal senior moment. So a couple of examples, I know the text is kind of small here, but I'll just point out a couple of examples that I think stand out to me are, temporarily misplacing your keys or your glasses in your house. Well, that's a pretty normal thing that happens to everyone, and it might happen to you more when you get older. But something like misplacing items or putting them in unusual places. So putting your glasses in the refrigerator, for instance. That's something that certainly would be more concerning. Another good example I think that comes up here is, sometimes you might have a hard time thinking of the right word that you want to say. That can usually be pretty normal, but if you're forgetting really simple words that you use all the time, or if you're substituting words and saying sentences that they come out and they don't make sense to the people who are listening to you, that's something that would be more concerning. But again, these are all the kinds of things that you would talk about with your primary care doctor or a neurologist if you were to come in for an evaluation. And so next I want to really quickly go through some of the research that we're excited about in this field before we really get down to why we're all here, which is what you can actually do to prevent cognitive decline. So as Dr. Gale mentioned, we know that right now we don't have any drug treatments, disease-modifying therapies for a disease like Alzheimer's, but we do know that there are certain lifestyle-related modifiable risk factors. And so if you look at large populations over many, many, many years, you can get a sense of what their lifestyle looks like and what happens to each individual in the study. And what we know from looking at tons and tons and tons of people is that things like smoking, physical inactivity, and depression are very highly correlated with risk for Alzheimer's disease, which means that people who do these things more, people who smoke a lot, people who are physically inactive, people who have experienced depression or loneliness, are more likely to develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And so we'll talk kind of through all of these things and how to address them, but a couple that I think are particularly important in the research, physical inactivity, especially because it is not just an independent risk factor, but it's also associated with other things like depression, obesity, other cardiovascular risk factors. So it's kind of, being physically active, you're, giving the brain kind of multiple hits. And depression ties into that. We know that that's a huge contributor to AD cases in the US and also worldwide. And then also we know that low education, which is something that for the most part you can't control as much in mid to late life, but is more of an early life risk factor, was important in this particular study in the worldwide population, but was a relatively small contributor in the US population. And so, excuse me, from all of this research, figuring out what these risk factors actually are, the next phase of research is trying to actually prevent them. So if you are to modify someone's activity or modify their diet or have them be more socially or cognitively active in midlife, does that same person actually experience less cognitive decline later in life? And so there's a bunch of kind of ongoing and interesting studies. I think the big one that made big waves in our field was in at-risk individuals, this top study. This was the FINGER study, the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study to Prevent Cognitive Impairment and Disability. So it's kind of a mouthful. But basically what they did is they took people who were at risk and elderly, and at risk was, they had a number of different risk factors like physical inactivity, family history, a lot of things, and basically put them through this 2-year intervention where they had nutritional counseling, they had personal trainers to help with their exercise, they did cognitive training, and they had people who helped them manage things like diabetes or overweight and obesity. And these people improved or maintained their cognitive function. Even though they were at high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, they maintained their cognitive function or improved relative to a group that didn't get this intervention. And so this was really exciting for us because it was kind of the first time that we, saw in a big population that by actually changing these things, you could impact the course of the disease. There have been similar studies in patients who have subjective cognitive decline. So the MAPT, I won't go through the details, it's like a very similar protocol to FINGER, and then also in patients who already have mild cognitive impairment. So if you take patients who already have cognitive impairment and put them through, all of these different activities, can you actually slow down the rate of decline?
And what was the result?
So all of these studies showed an impact on cognition in all of these different groups, and
were these all different hospitals, or?
Yeah.
And like how many people would make a study?
Yeah, so different, these were all kind of different sizes. The FINGER study was thousands, and that's why it was particularly exciting, because it was a huge study. The MAPT, I don't remember the exact number, it was definitely smaller. I don't know if you remember. The Thinking Fit was a pilot study, so this was only a handful of individuals, like 40 to 50 individuals. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of what a study like this might look like, so we run kind of similar studies, and we think about similar studies in our clinic as well. And so this is just a schematic from the Thinking Fit study, and what this shows is that for every participant, they went through a control period where they just reported their activities, they did no activity modification, just went about their day-to-day lives. And then in the next phase of the study, they did this activity intervention where they had individual cognitive therapy, group cognitive therapy, and physical activity. This was like a coached workout session with a personal trainer. And then they ended the trial. And so they showed positive results on cognition in this small group and plan to scale up the results of this study. And so based on the FINGER study, a ton of research money is going into replicating studies like this in very large samples. And so the biggest kind of upcoming or planned study is of 2,500 individuals across the US. And it's using a very similar protocol to the FINGER study. And so that includes physical exercise, nutritional counseling and modification, cognitive and social stimulation. So this is guided with a teacher or with a computer program. and then extra support for helping people manage other medical conditions that they have. And they're going to look at changes in different aspects of cognitive functioning and memory. And this is all going to be primarily funded through the Alzheimer's Association. It's a $20 million study. So this will be something to keep an eye on. Certainly will be interesting. So just to kind of briefly summarize about the research, we could talk, there's a lot of studies in this field, but I think the important take-home point for me, and when I talk to patients who come into our clinic, is that what we have really found is that it's multimodal studies that show the greatest effect. And so this means that there's a lot of studies that only study physical activity, only study diet, etc. But the studies that we are particularly excited about are the studies where they put patients through these protocols where they do kind of a little bit of everything. And I think that really informs how we think about what we recommend to our patients, because we think that, we're going to give you a lot of different recommendations and you don't have to do them all, but we think that doing a little bit of exercise, changing your diet a little bit, maybe being a little bit more socially and cognitively engaged, all of those together are going to be better than just doing a lot of one thing. And so these are just two studies that, kind of give the same take-home point that I just said. This graph on the left, we can see, so this was a study that looked at physical activity and diet. And the line in black on the top, this is people who were, this is a little confusing, so this was the probability of remaining AD free. So these are people who did not get Alzheimer's disease. And so what you can see from this graph is that, over 12 years, the people who had high physical activity and really good diet were the group that remained Alzheimer's free for the longest. And similar here, this was just a different study that looked at mental and physical and social activity. And we saw that in this study, the people who had high levels of both cognitive activity and physical activity did the best out of the entire group. Great. So now what we've all been waiting for, which is what does this research actually tell us, and what does it mean for what you can do in your day-to-day life? So I'll go through some recommendations for diet and exercise, as well as social and cognitive activity, and then I will give the mic back to Dr. Gale to talk about cognitive reserve, sleep, stress, medications, and supplements. So first, just to get started, this is something we think a lot about when we talk to patients about this, because everyone kind of knows or has a sense of, what's good for you. And a lot of that comes from what's good for your heart, what's going to keep your heart healthy. And the great thing, I think, about brain health is that we know that brain health and heart health are linked, that anything you do that's healthy for your heart is also going to be healthy for your brain, and a lot of the things that you can do to take care of your brain are also going to take care of your heart. And so I think that you will probably not be surprised by many of these recommendations, because they're probably things you've heard with regards to heart health before. And so just to give an overview of kind of what we'll go through and what's the most evidence-based, so we really think of all of the things that we recommend and all of the things that you could possibly do to help both your heart and your brain. The things that have the strongest evidence are physical activity, diet and nutrition, and we'll talk a little bit more about specific diets, and then social and cognitive activity, and those two things really go hand in hand. We'll also touch briefly on sleep hygiene and stress management, managing your medications, and taking care of your overall health and well-being. And as I said before, we know that there's significant evidence that doing these kinds of things can both decrease the chance of developing dementia, but also if you already are experiencing some kind of issues with your cognition, that it can kind of slow or boost up the shape of that curve and help you kind of stay where you are and stay stable. And we also know that doing a set of these things is more effective in slowing the rate of cognitive decline than doing just one thing. So to start out with physical activity, we know that in terms of both preventing and also slowing the rate of decline, we know that cardiovascular activity specifically is the most strongly associated with lowering your risk of both developing cognitive impairment and also progressing in cognitive impairment. We know even in healthy people, regular cardiovascular activity helps improve things like their local cognition, executive function, and attention. So these are patients both who are healthy and at risk, and also patients who already have cognitive impairment. There's a bunch of different studies that study kind of different, how many times per week and how often and how long the sessions are. I think the general consensus that we like to recommend is 30 to 40 minutes, 3 to 4 times per week. And that is what we would consider to be like moderate cardiovascular activity. The cardiovascular component is super important. So I put below here, this is from the American Heart Association, looking at your target heart rate. So, this is not full out, sprinting exertion. We want you to be kind of in this moderate middle group here. So not getting to your highest maximum heart rate, but just boosting your heart rate up and sustaining it over a long period of time. And we know that this is particularly important, we think, because aerobic cardiovascular exercise increases the flow of blood and the flow of oxygen to your brain, and helps keep your neurons and other parts of your brain kind of healthy and help them live a little bit longer and grow a little bit more. And so again, I told you that the goal is to have moderate activity level consistently over about 30 to 40 minutes, and there's a bunch of things that you can do to achieve this. So I think the most obvious one that most people will be able to do, it looks like many people in this room will be able to do, is walking. So that can be on the treadmill or walking outside. But we also think that bicycling, stationary bicycling, any kind of group activity where you're getting your heart rate up a little bit, like a group fitness class, swimming, water aerobics. There's a lot of different options here, and many of which are low impact and people can sustain until very late into their lives. And so overall, the goal of cardiovascular activity is to increase your heart rate, and you can do that. You can, feel your pulse here. You can feel it on your wrist. You can also look for feeling a little bit out of breath. Not too out of breath that you can't have a conversation in short sentences, but if you're walking with a friend and you can kind of drone on and on and on like I'm doing right now, then you're not exercising quite hard enough. You can also think about if you're sweating lightly, but not drenched. That's kind of right where you want to be. And the last point on this slide I think is also super important. So cardiovascular activity is not, strength training often doesn't really fall under that umbrella, but we still want you to continue to do that. It's super important for preventing falls and preventing injury and making sure you can continue to do the cardiovascular exercise for as long as possible. So in terms of diet, I'll go through some specifics here. But the kind of things to keep an eye out for are the Mediterranean or the MIND style diet. So this is overall an anti-inflammatory diet that we know is associated with a lower risk. Okay, we good?
That's the best place.
Okay, great. And we're done. No, is associated with a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's and also of continuing to decline on that cognitive decline curve. So just briefly to go through this, but I'll throw some more specific recommendations up here as well. The kind of things to think about in the Mediterranean style diet are every day having some fresh fruits and vegetables, and specifically greens. Getting most of your protein from what we call legumes broadly, but which includes beans, chickpeas, lentils, and nuts. And fish, basically any kind of fish. We know have omega-3 fatty acids, which are healthy for the brain and healthy for the heart. Getting most of your carbohydrates from whole grains, so that's like whole grain bread, brown rice, some of the ancient grains like quinoa or farro, and then using olive oil as opposed to a canola oil or butter or something for cooking. And then in moderation, we think things like poultry, eggs, dairy, and the Mediterranean diet also includes wine, up to 1 glass per day is fine. And then things to avoid would be sweets with refined sugars, red meat, and saturated fats like butter. So just to go through a little bit more of what this might look like. So I mentioned whole grains, and some examples would be, like I said, whole grain bread or brown rice. There's also great whole grain pastas these days. So basically, if you think that every time you're going to eat, something that's carb heavy, like white bread or white rice. You know, it's totally fine. We really strongly encourage you to have carbohydrates in this diet. It's not a low carb diet by any means, but as long as they're whole grains that your body can process slowly and derive a lot of nutrients from. So this is I think this is a good picture because this shows what you're getting in whole grain is the whole grain. And when you eat any of these white products, they're really stripping away most of what has any nutritional value. I talked about green leafy vegetables. This can be literally anything. We just would say stay away from iceberg. I mean, you can eat it, it just won't really give you any nutrients because it's water. And then other vegetables, we recommend at least 1 serving per day, and this can be really anything. There's nothing you want to specifically try to eat more of or stay away from. It's really more about including a diversity of vegetables and of fruits as well to kind of get the broad spectrum of phytonutrients. Yes, thank you. Good point. So in terms of these actual specific recommendations, we will share this with the senior center here, and so you'll be able to get a copy of this as well. So don't worry about writing anything down or, you know, it's a lot of specifics. I talked about extra virgin olive oil, about 1 serving per day. So if you think about incorporating that in your salad dressing or just in your cooking or, you know, wherever, there's a lot of ways to do this. We think nuts as well are really high in kind of the healthy unsaturated fats. And we say 5 servings per week, or basically a serving every day, and that's like about a handful. It's not a ton, but a little bit every day is great. I talked some about fruits. I think berries specifically, and specifically blueberries of all things, have kind of the strongest evidence base, but really getting a diverse set of fruits and berries. And then beans and legumes, this can be anything. This can be hummus, tofu, any soy products. These are like kidney beans, I think. You know, any bean that would come in a can is great. We, in the Mediterranean diet, we kind of recommend getting most of your protein from fish or chicken, and especially thinking about incorporating some of the fattier fishes that are a little higher in those omega-3s, and those are salmon and tuna and mackerel, which is not up here, but is another one you can think about. But really any kind of seafood, even like shrimp, scallops, lobster, is going to have many of these kind of good heart and brain healthy compounds. And then I already told you things to avoid: red meat, processed meat, so this is like lunch counter meat or sausage or pepperoni, butter, pastries and other desserts, fried food, refined sugar. And I always get this question, so I'll just answer it now. People always ask me about sugar substitutes, like Splenda or whatnot, and we actually think they're probably equally bad, unfortunately. Sorry. And just a little bit about the research behind the diet. So the way that we sort of come up with these recommendations is we look at these large samples of people who just live in the community, and you track what they eat over years and years and years. So in this study, this was over 2,000 people who started out healthy at year 0, and this is a big study in New York, and they basically saw that over 10 years, people who had high adherence to this diet, the Mediterranean style diet, actually survived for longer and also had lower rates of cognitive decline. So these are the kinds of studies that we would do to kind of test these different aspects of diet. And in terms of different types of diet you might hear about, so I mentioned Mind and Mediterranean style. You also might hear about DASH, which is a very similar type of diet. All of these, if you go back, we'll send this out, but if you go back to that kind of like traffic light thing that I put up at the beginning, all of them fall into that exact same pattern. So if you're following DASH, Mediterranean, Mind, it's all the same and it's all good for you. What these two graphs just show is this is a study from 2014 where they did a head-to-head comparison of these two, of DASH and the Mediterranean style diet, and found that following either was basically equally good in terms of your cognition. And then what researchers have done is kind of combined both the DASH and the Mediterranean into this diet called MIND, which is the Mediterranean DASH Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. But I want to just make sure that you guys kind of know all of these different things that you might, ways that people might refer to these kinds of diets so that if it comes up, you'll know what we're talking about. So I'll go through a few slides on social and cognitive activity before I wrap up here. So we know that keeping the brain active and challenged, we like to think of the brain kind of as a muscle. So, you know, we think use it or lose it a little bit. Like the more that you're keeping it active, the more that you're challenging it, the more it's gonna keep being able to learn new things and be adaptable and remember the things you need to remember, etc. And so we know that social activity and cognitive activity is especially helpful for memory and processing speed. So how fast you can actually think about things and do tasks that need you to do a lot of thinking or organization. We know that things like learning new skills, being active in your community, keeping in touch with friends and family, these are all really good examples that would fall into these categories. And we also know that both mid and late life activity levels are important. So it's not just getting into retirement and saying, okay, great, now I'm gonna challenge my brain all the time. We also know that it's important what you have done in your middle-aged years as well. But that being said, we also know that because your late life activity is still important, it's never too late to start or kind of bump up your activity levels in any of these categories. So just some examples I put up here. You can, any of these things you can do alone at home or out in the community. So things like puzzles and games, reading, kind of taking in new information, challenging yourself in that way. Learning, I talked about learning new skills. Socializing, whether it's by phone or in person or having people over to your home, whatever it may be. And then, of course, activities out in the community. And these are great, something like coming to a talk like this, because you're both, you're taking in information, you might be learning something new, but you have the opportunity to interact socially with all these people around you. So you're really getting a little bit of both here. And just a little bit about the research here. So in terms of social activity, we know that people who have smaller social networks, who interact with fewer people on a day-to-day basis, are more likely to experience cognitive decline. And so we, on the flip side of that, we know that people who have daily contact with friends and family, whether it's by phone or in person or however you communicate, people who have that daily contact cut their risk of dementia in this study in half. So this is a hugely important part, we know, of cognitive decline and cognitive aging. We also know this kind of second study that's mentioned here talks a little bit about depression, which I mentioned earlier. So we know that people who are lonely and who have smaller social networks have faster cognitive decline. And that is not just being lonely or having a small group of people you talk to, but actually having active depression or a diagnosis of depression on top of that actually makes cognitive decline even faster. And so when we talk about social and cognitive activity, we're really trying to think about broadening your social network, making sure you're doing things that are fulfilling. And the good news here is that there's a ton of different things that can fall into this category. And I think that's it for me. Yeah. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gale, who will talk about the rest of these things that I've listed, and then we'll take some questions from you.
Thank you. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. We're giving you the social and cognitive simulation today. We will have more to come, and then we'll take some questions. Okay. So 3 last topics. So cognitive reserve. So this is an important topic. So what cognitive reserve is it's the resilience of the brain to function at the highest level that it can, and to resist the changes that happen with normal aging or that happen with disease, like Alzheimer's. So that's the concept. There are multiple factors that contribute to cognitive reserve. That is, let's think about it as the strength of your brain. Some of them are things we can do something about, and some of them we can't. For example, people are endowed with different levels of intellectual ability, which they can build on, okay? But that, for better or for worse, and controversially or not controversially, that goes into cognitive reserve, okay? The degree of childhood education that one gets. So if you think about the public health implications of this, and globally, is also a factor that builds the strength of the brain, but with limited formal education, it is an increased risk factor for later life cognitive decline. So you can imagine that that's a very complicated social and global issue to consider. Other aspects of cognitive reserve include things like the degree of brain injury that someone has had, say 1 or 2 concussions or 3 or 4 concussions that someone had playing sports when they were young versus dozens and hundreds of subconcussive or concussive injuries like, with football players and that kind of thing. So the degree of controlling one's own health problems. So someone who has high blood pressure for 30 or 40 years and doesn't control it or doesn't seek ways to control it is at more risk for lower cognitive reserve and thus dementia. So what this graph is showing is that this graph is actually showing that the degree of plaques in the brain that are the hallmark for Alzheimer's disease, which you can identify these days using particular imaging scans of the brain, like PET scans. If you take a group of people with the highest cognitive activity at any age, they have the lowest degree of evidence of early changes of Alzheimer's disease or plaques in the brain. Okay, we can come back to that more, but there's evidence to show that there's biological changes that are reduced or mitigated by doing these brain healthy activities, which social stimulation is another example of cognitive reserve. So on the topic of building a resilient brain, the optimal thing is to have lifelong mental stimulation. Okay, so again, this is the curve that we introduced at the beginning. So on the x-axis is age, and on the y-axis is cognitive function. So the purple curve is the average population that has normal changes with aging is the purple curve. For people who may have early Alzheimer's disease or are going to get Alzheimer's disease that we don't know about, the higher their resilience in the brain, the less severe the cognitive function is at that age. Does that make sense? So for whatever factors go into building a healthy brain makes a difference if that individual is susceptible or vulnerable to get Alzheimer's disease. Their symptoms will either be a later onset or will be less severe than their peer who doesn't have, a resilient brain. This schematic on the right is showing some of the things a couple of things I didn't mention about building cognitive reserve. So social support, which Hope touched on. So people with, if you have more of a social network, which is just defined as the number of people that you engage with on a daily or weekly basis, through midlife on, let's say, have more of a cognitive reserve. The brain has more connections, more synapses, more plasticity in those cases. And I mentioned education. And positive affect is an interesting topic. People who think positively or who manage stress or manage periods of depression in whatever way that they do, through the health system, through doctors, through their own activities, etc., have a stronger brain and are more resilient when there's cognitive decline. Okay, 2 more topics, sleep and stress. So first, sleep. So sleep is extremely important for the brain, as we know. So there's things that happen overnight in the brain, we know from animal studies and from human studies, that are in charge of consolidating memories that occurred during the day. So people with disrupted sleep have a disrupted mechanism of really what we call consolidation, or inserting information or memory in the brain to hold for longer periods of time. And there have been a number of studies to show that people who have disrupted sleep, significant disrupted sleep, or who have sleep disorders like, say, obstructive sleep apnea that is not treated, that is not addressed, have an increased risk of having plaques in the brain. So again, going to the most common type of dementia, which is Alzheimer's disease, there's evidence that suboptimal sleep is itself a risk factor, an independent risk factor for the development of early changes of Alzheimer's disease. So what this schematic is showing is that it's kind of like a negative catch-22 cycle of people with like poor quality of sleep, have an increased activity in the brain, neuronal activity, which leads to breakdown of cells, which leads to accumulation of the bad actors in the brain, which are these plaques and tangles that make up the disease that we call Alzheimer's disease are basically accumulation of the breakdown of cell products that are not being taken out appropriately in the normal brain function. So sleep is an important function, is a evolutionarily required and necessary brain function that helps us actually to kind of take out the trash at night in the brain, and also to lay down the tracks of memory that we form during the day. So that's essentially what this is showing. So the practical aspects of that are, who's ever heard of the term sleep hygiene before? A couple. There's a term we used that is called sleep hygiene, which is essentially good sleep behavior. So doing things for you, whatever that is for you, and it's different for everyone, that puts you in a state in the evenings to get ready for bed, to decompress, and then to go to sleep and have the best chance of having a restful night. So those include things like being physically active during the day. We know that the more people are physically active in general, of all ages, the more tired they are, and the more restorative sleep is. Keeping your bedroom quiet, dark, and relaxing at night. Removing electronic devices. If you're feel like you're not getting restful sleep, but your behavior includes, looking at a bright screen on the iPad and reading before you go to bed, or watching movies late into the night, then you're not setting the brain up, I guess, for the natural processes that it would go through to give yourself restful sleep. And then some of the obvious things like avoiding large meals at night, avoiding caffeine and alcohol before bedtime. So in the top, I put in, which was kind of an interesting comment about what the CDC, what the Centers for Disease Control says about optimal sleep per age. So from age 18 to 60, evidence shows that you need 7 hours of sleep per night, let's say. In age 60 to 64, it's 7 to 9 hours, so a little bit more. And then age 65 and up is 7 to 8 hours. So everyone is in the range of 7 to 8, 7 to 9 or so, let's say. But that's something to think about. You also have to couple this with what we know with aging is that people actually tend to sleep less. Who thinks this decade they're sleeping less hours than they were in previous decades? Show of hands. That's a very common experience and phenomenon, despite the recommendations that many people, not everyone, age 60s, 70s, and 80s generally sleep less. They tend to wake up earlier, etc. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's a normal, function. But you have to do what you can to try to get optimal sleep for age. I see hands. Go ahead.
What about bathroom calls? Is that
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. The plague of all of us when we get older in particular. So if you're falling back to sleep reasonably well, even if you're getting up a couple times, I think you can throw that into the category of restorative sleep. It's not optimal. The optimal thing would be to stay sleeping. You can reduce that by the obvious things like not drinking liquids late at night, etc. But I don't know if I have a great answer. I think what the problem that I've seen with patients is if something is on someone's mind, or they feel particularly stressed or anxious, they're more likely to not be able to fall back asleep when they get up for a bathroom break. So we'll come back. Let me finish. Yeah, please. Sure.
Because I've spoken to a number of people, and they seem to think two maybe 3 times is not excessive once you get into your 80s or so, as you get older. And I
Yeah.
don't know, in fact, when we were talking about much of this, we looked at 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
happens when we get into our 80s
Sure.
or 90s?
yeah.
Can we do the same thing that we're discussing as far as health issues and amount of sleep and that sort of thing?
Sure. So when you mentioned that, I'm trying to think about studies and the science to give you a real evidence-supported answer.
Yeah.
I mean, these large population studies typically include age 55 to 85. That's a typical higher end cutoff. For some of our drug research studies, they go to 90, but usually it's 85. So I think that this data generally applies, assuming that the distribution of age range is fairly equivalent, which is usually a target, applies up through mid-80s, you know. But you're right. I mean, we talk about this all the time in our work. The brain health recommendation for someone who's 65 versus 85 is just inherently different in mobility, in various factors. I will say that maintaining one's overall health, emotional health as well as physical health, is extremely important at all ages. So someone with sugar imbalance or uncontrolled sugars, pre-diabetes or diabetes, or someone with blood pressure that is uncontrolled at any age through 80 to 85 is itself a risk factor even at that age for declining, for example.
I take melatonin to help me relax in the evening.
Sure,
I
yeah.
assume that's not an issue or a problem.
It's fine. That's on my last slide.
Oh, okay.
I'll get there in a second. Let me go. I'll be there 2 seconds. 2 seconds. I promise. We will get to everybody. Okay. So just a quick thing about stress. So basically, there is biological, scientific evidence that the experience of stress is itself a risk factor for poor brain functioning, and in particular, you can demonstrate this on cognitive testing. If someone has detailed pencil paper testing in situations of stress, what we think about is their cognitive or mental function is declined compared to not. So this just makes the point that there's a stress response in the body that's a physiological stress response that happens that impairs the brain function, cognitive behavioral functioning. So just to plug in for a couple of things, there's a general practice of awareness that there's a buzzword of mindfulness that many people have heard about. I say buzzword only because there are truly genuine practices of mindfulness, and then there are TV commercials of how to be mindful. I encourage you to think about and look into what this term means, the practice of mindfulness. It can be very life-changing for people. It's just a simple awareness of the body, awareness of thoughts, watching one's thoughts, and emotions enter the brain and seeing them as thoughts, and that you may not be the author of those thoughts, but they kind of arise in consciousness and then go away. That kind of strategy, which is a cousin to meditation or Eastern-based practices, is very helpful and interesting to look at. Tai Chi is listed here, and general breathing exercises and ways of physical relaxation. These are things that we all know about, but hearing about it and seeing it in the context of memory and thinking difficulties and neurology, I hope will be helpful. And then finally, finally, medications and supplements and their relationship with brain health in general. So there's a lot to talk about. This could be 2 whole lectures to discuss because there's a huge industry, as you know, promoting supplements for brain health, like out there. The recent one is this Prevagen, which is the jellyfish extract, where you can take some. What this highlights, actually the next slide does, I'll get to that in a second. So over-the-counter medications like Benadryl, which is Tylenol PM, and a couple other formulations are not great for the brain. Okay, they're on an occasional basis, sure, but it's important generally to run by your primary care doctor or read a little bit more about supplements that you're taking in general to see how they're impacting the brain. For example, Benadryl or diphenhydramine, it has some anti-cognitive effects. The reason why it helps people relax and or sleep is because it's kind of shutting the brain down in a way that is not as beneficial as something like melatonin, which the gentleman over here mentioned. So melatonin is generally thought to be a safe, natural supplement. The brain produces melatonin on its own. It's the hormone that allows the brain to get into sleep mode. Melatonin is an example of a supplement that could be brain-friendly and beneficial. There are medications that you might get for various conditions that have some anti-memory or anti-cognitive effects. These are things, again, to talk with your primary care doctor and say, hey, can we spend a minute just to go over the medications I'm taking to make sure that there's nothing that's there that, especially for people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, can be particularly detrimental to cognition. I put it not to call these medications out, but I will for a couple of them. There are bladder medications like oxybutynin, which is Detrol, for example, which is not a great medication for the brain. You know, there are alternatives, for example. There are reflux medications, and there are particular blood pressure medications. You have to make an individual decision with the docs that you talk to decide for you, but this is sometimes even well-intentioned providers are not thinking as much about cognition and memory and aging when they think about medications. So it's something to consider. And then I put in smoking, for example, we know for various reasons is not healthy. This should be an obvious point, but in brain health, it's the same. It's the case. Marijuana or THC, cannabis, cannabidiol oils, all of that is very difficult and controversial to draw conclusions about, because there's a lot of research going on in the benefits of cannabis for Alzheimer's disease in particular, and also occasional lifelong use of cannabis doesn't seem to be detrimental, harmful to the brain. Daily chronic use of cannabis over many years definitely has cognitive side effects, which has been demonstrated in many studies when you just do normal cognitive testing for someone who reports 20, 30 years of frequent cannabis use, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a whole kind of long, interesting discussion, but what's an interesting part of that is that cannabis is being used in various formulations in a lot of neurological conditions, like multiple sclerosis is a good example, Alzheimer's disease, et cetera. So stay tuned for the story about cannabis. In Massachusetts, we have open arms for cannabis in multiple ways, so we will be embracing that. Okay, and then lastly, I'll just highlight, let me say one thing about this. Vitamin E is really the only supplement that has enough evidence from studies that has benefit for the brain, and in some studies in Alzheimer's disease has shown some change of people's a benefit of people's daily functioning over time. It's not major, but it's enough that we have these conversations with patients with Alzheimer's disease in our clinic that it's pretty reasonable to be on vitamin E supplement. Okay.
How much?
So, 1,000 international units or milligrams, but IUs is typically the dose, twice a day. So there's a couple of studies that have shown that there's some hint of benefit for functional decline, for daily functioning decline with vitamin E. I mentioned that to contrast with a lot of other supplements like ginseng or ginkgo or a lot of different things. If you read online, you will read about coconut oil is another good example. All of these may have an individual benefit and are probably safe for you or for me or for someone else. But as far as the studies have shown, when you look at 1,000 people to try to prove that something like coconut oil, teaspoons a day can make a difference with the decline for Alzheimer's disease, there's no evidence that that's the case. Okay, does that make sense? So I've, in an individual basis, I've had many patients who, let's say a handful of patients who've done a concerted trial of something like ginkgo as a supplement, and they have experienced what they perceive as memory boost and less decline. I think as a doctor, hearing that, I'm okay with the safety, I'm totally fine with that. Same thing with ginseng, same thing with coconut oil, same thing with Prevagen, this medication, this supplement I mentioned that's an extract of jellyfish. But I can tell you from the scientific standpoint, when these things have been studied in the way that aspirin has been studied, or the kind of typical randomized controlled trials, the only thing that really has kind of a hint of a benefit is vitamin D supplements, basically. To this point, at this point in time. That could change next year, that could change the year after, but that's where the science is right now.
And it's B12 specifically, right?
So this B is actually talking about like B12, but also B6 and B1, thiamine and riboflavin as well. Riboflavin is B2. It's B6. It's pyridoxine. Anyway, B1, B6, and B12. But you're right. I put B12 here because B12 is a common test that would be done in a primary care office or in a neurology office to look for deficiency. If someone is low vitamin B12, it should be replaced with vitamin B supplements or with injections, but there's no evidence that superdosing on vitamin B, if your levels are normal, there's no evidence that taking more vitamin B above your normal blood levels is going to do something for your risk of decline. Does that make sense? It can worsen your normal decline or your decline with existing Alzheimer's if it's low, but there's no evidence of super supplementing above it. Can I finish last one? And then we'll okay, just because I want to, okay. So, last slide. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, the metabolic syndrome, which includes being overweight, in particular at the waist, and depression, are each important health issues that are particularly important for the brain that should be considered, addressed, talked about with doctors, and done. Everything should be done to try to reduce their morbidity. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe a little after on that one. We'll get started.
I'm on the dot.
On the dot? Okay, perfect. I timed it perfectly. Well, I'm grateful to be here today. My name is Christine. I'm here from the Alzheimer's Association's Massachusetts and New Hampshire chapter. So we cover both two states, Massachusetts and New Hampshire. I've been at the association for about 4.5 years. I was previously working on our 24/7 helpline, which I may reference as we're going through the program as a place that you can go for additional resources or support, and I can speak to that directly. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. For my experience on that, through that program, and I've recently been, since about May of this year, in the role as regional manager for Greater Boston and Northeastern Massachusetts. And my role is to provide education and programming in the community and connect with Greater Boston and Northeastern Massachusetts. So I'm grateful to be here today. You guys have a great community here. I think, how is the screen looking for everyone? Is this pretty clear, even with this light on?
Yep.
That's good for everyone? Okay. Good? Okay. This projector is very nice. Thank you, Nisha. So also we're a good sized group, but I certainly want to make sure that you're getting the questions that you have asked and answered. So feel free, as we're moving through the content of the presentation today, if something jumps out as a question, raise your hand and we can make sure we get to those. I'll also allow some time at the end, and certainly if you want to talk to me one-on-one afterward, I'm happy to chat. One more housekeeping item. How's my volume? Can everyone hear me okay? All right. If that's getting a little wonky at any point, just give me a more feverish wave. If my volume isn't good, here, and this will mean a question. Does that work for everyone? Okay, good. All right, great. If other things get wonky too, you can let me know.
I love that.
So we're here today to haven't used that word or
no.
blast
Blast
from the past?
I've never heard it. No, but I like it.
Well, now you know.
Yeah,
Good.
yes, I might start using it.
There we go.
Okay.
If there's, you can put that on your evaluation that you picked up something new today, a new word. Great. So we're here today to talk about the basics. We're going to be talking about memory loss, Alzheimer's disease, other forms of dementia. So again, as we move through this program, if you have any questions, let me know. We will be hearing, there's a few videos that are embedded in this presentation so that you'll hear from some experts, people from Alzheimer's disease centers or our home office in Chicago, or people living with the disease or their care partners who may be sharing a little bit, kind of illuminate some of or expand upon some of the information that we'll be talking about from their own experience. Well, first, Ron jumped right in. So Ron is the director of the Mayo Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and he's going to start off by sort of framing the idea and the prevalence, knowing that one of the greatest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is advanced age. So he's going to talk about what that means in terms of the prevalence of the disease and what we're seeing in terms of that increasing in the United States and globally.
In general, we talk about in individuals age 65 and older that people have perhaps an 8 to 10% risk of Alzheimer's disease over the lifetime. But it's clearly age related. So if your family tends to live into their 80s and maybe 90s, your risk is going to go up rather dramatically. On the other hand, if the people in your family tend to die in their 70s, the risk is lower. But it's clearly an age-related phenomenon. And with baby boomers, those individuals born between the years of 1946 and 1964, moving into their 60s, this is going to exaggerate the number of people eligible, so to speak, for Alzheimer's disease rather dramatically. Some people have indicated that if we do not do something for Alzheimer's disease, meaning delay the onset, slow the progression, ideally we'd like to cure the disease, but even if we have these modulating effects on Alzheimer's disease, it as a single entity will bankrupt the healthcare system as we know it. Because there's so many people in that age who will need services, who will need extra care.
No one can hear. Is that fair to say? Very low. Okay. So the speakers are connected to my computer, which is connected here, so I'm somewhat limited in terms of stretching, but I'll give a little synopsis. We'll have Ron's photo up here, Dr. Peterson. He appears very wise, I hope, to everyone. So I can share a little bit of what he shared. He's talking about how we know that the population is getting older, and that we also know that one of the greatest risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease is increased age. And so what does that mean for prevalence? We're already seeing that we know right now about 5.7 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, about 130,000 residents in Massachusetts. We also know that that number is likely underreported. About 50% of people that have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease don't know that they do. It's not being communicated as well within the medical system, and also people aren't necessarily seeking and receiving a diagnosis. So we imagine that those numbers may be greater. Add to that an increased or growing population of older adults, and we can see how that prevalence will increase over time in terms of what we're seeing, the number of people with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. And he's also talking about in this in terms of impact, the importance of research and what research is looking at in terms of prevalence, so not prevalence, excuse me, prevention, so preventing the disease from happening, but also really important research that's happening in terms of modifying the course of the disease. So can they slow it down or stop it once it starts, in addition to hopefully someday coming up with some treatments that prevent the disease from happening in the first place. So that's just sort of laying a little bit of the foundation about why it's important to talk about what Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia are, and have a sense of what's going on, knowing that more and more people may be diagnosed with this disease as we're seeing the population age as well.
So what percentage?
Sure.
Is it
In term percentage,
in Massachusetts have Alzheimer's?
yeah, that's a good question. We know about, I'm trying to think of what the population in Massachusetts is. That's a good question. I know from the data about 130,000 people have the diagnosis. Again, likely underreported. Anyone off the top of their head know the population in Massachusetts? No. It's a great question in terms of what the percentage is. I'll reference, as I mentioned it before, and we'll reference it again, our 24/7 helpline is a great resource for specific questions like that, or things that if I might touch upon, but you want to expand upon, or I might reference. My colleagues that are on the helpline have access to all sorts of census data, new research that's come out, does coconut oil cure or cause Alzheimer's disease, anything you might read in the paper. My colleagues can answer some of those questions in more detail if I don't know the answer, like that great question today. Any other questions so far? Okay.
In general,
I don't want to go there. So what we want to talk about, or one of the things that I like to start off talking about is what are some typical changes or age-related changes related to memory and thinking that may be related to age versus related to Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. We know that as we age, the body begins to slow down or change in some ways. There's some change in muscle tone, some response or reaction time in the body. We know there are physical changes that are accompanying aging. Similarly, we see some changes that are expected with the memory, with the mind as well, not just the memory, with thinking, processing time. There are some normal age-related changes that we see that are typical. You'll see a few of them up here. I think what's important to highlight is you'll see a few of these examples: making a bad decision once in a while, losing things from time to time. The distinction there is that there are incidences where this is happening not across the board or not globally. So from time to time, or there are situations where you might see a change in your memory or thinking, but it's not in every area of your life, for example. Another common question is about misplacing keys or misplacing an item in the home. And what may be related to a more age-related change might be that you're not sure where it is, but you can kind of retrace your steps, or maybe 10 minutes later it's like, oh, aha, the keys are there, that other place that I put them. When someone has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, or it's starting to tip over to something that you might want to look into a bit more, you're starting to see that ability to retrace those steps is not there anymore, or it's impaired to the extent that it's harder to retrace those steps to refine where the keys are. You might need to start relying on more cues or props around the home, other things to kind of guide you to where the keys may be, versus your memory at some point being able to recall that. Does that make some sense? Okay. Those are a few examples. I think it's important also to highlight up here the bad, questionable, maybe not bad, maybe questionable decision making, forgetting which word to use. I think a lot of times when we're thinking about Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, like I use the word wonky. I don't know if I typically use that word, but that's what came out. We oftentimes think about short-term memory changes, and there are oftentimes other symptoms that may be associated with something going on that may be related to Alzheimer's disease, another form of dementia, or maybe worth just getting a more formal diagnosis and seeing what is going on that's causing these symptoms. It's not just memory related. So changes in judgment or thinking. Sometimes it's hard to recognize that in our own selves, but those around us may be questioning how decisions are being made, or maybe bill paying or other daily routine or normal routine situations are becoming a bit more difficult or aren't being followed through with in the same way, might prompt some discussion about, is there a problem solving challenge? Is something like paying the bills that you've always done starting to become a little bit more difficult? And again, it's a one-time thing. Is there a lot of other variables that are at play, like attention, distraction, or are you seeing this consistently over time? We'll talk a little bit about what that consistency might mean, but I think there's a little bit of that distinction there. We don't want to just think about memory. It's important, of course, but there are other things that our brain are doing in terms of our thinking that we want to be on the lookout for too. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. So I may skip what Joyce has to say since you won't be able to hear her, but I can give a little synopsis of what Joyce is sharing. She has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and she's sharing a little bit about the distinction there, that there were things she started to notice in herself that were falling sort of beyond this category that was just up there about normal age-related changes that you might see. We'll see on this next page here some changes that may be problematic. And she's highlighting that she was starting to see some confusion or changes in her memory that were starting to impact her daily life. So she was recognizing that the changes in her short-term memory were consistent. So it wasn't just related to maybe a missed appointment. It may be missing numerous appointments or numerous obligations that are on the calendar, starting to see things with a bit more consistency. And that prompted her to look into and see, is there something more that's going on? She noted in the synopsis that she gives about her story that she went to the doctor upon initially noticing what was going on, and they said that everything seemed okay, but she started to continue to see the symptoms that she was noticing progress or get a bit worse or more troublesome to her. So she went back again, she followed up and advocated for herself, and at that point it was found that they were able to do a bit more of a thorough diagnostic evaluation in combination with more symptoms that she was seeing, and she eventually received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So there's this consistency piece, and then I think there's that follow-up piece too. It's really important to start and reach out and advocate if you're noticing some changes, and then stay on it too. If you're noticing those things progress or change, you want to continue to follow up with your doctor about that as well. That's a little bit about Joyce's story, taking not verbatim, but synopsis of what she shared. And up here you'll see that there are some changes as well as on your slide that we know the 10 changes up here are associated with what we talk about the Alzheimer's Association are some of the 10 warning signs. So some of these changes in one of them or in isolation or even a few of them, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, but it may mean that something's going on that warrants a bit more of an evaluation or a conversation with the doctor to find out what's going on underneath this that's causing these symptoms to happen or these symptoms to change. We'll talk a little bit more about what some of those disease processes are or medical conditions that can cause some of these symptoms. But if you're noticing any of these changes, it's important to consult with your doctor. See about having a conversation with maybe your internist or primary care doctor to start. We'll talk a bit later on about what that diagnostic process looks like. But if you're seeing some of these changes, these are some of the signs that we as an organization, in collaboration with medical providers, have kind of come up with to say, these are some of the things that might be that tipping point, tipping over from the normal age-related changes in your memory and thinking to something that might be a bit more problematic. I think one of the kind of keys or hallmark pieces to consider in whatever the symptom is it disrupting your daily life? So your ability to function. Are the symptoms that you're seeing, whether it be a change in your short-term memory or a challenge processing information, maybe new problems speaking, so having trouble finding words or getting words out, is that starting to become troublesome enough that it's making it difficult for you to function in your day-to-day life? That's that tipping point that when we talk about what is dementia, in terms of it being diagnosable or to fit the criteria for that, the big change is that it's impacting your function. So you might have some of these symptoms, but they're mild, they're occasional, and it's not making it difficult for you to function day to day. The functional part is that tipping point over to what we might talk about with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. Is everyone following that okay? Does that make some sense? Mm-hmm. Any questions so far? Okay.
I've got one.
Sure, of course.
6.84 million.
Okay. 6.84 million and 130,000 diagnosed. My background's in social work. I did that for a reason. Math's not my strong suit.
No.
So we can see there, it's a increasing prevalence and a significant one. I mean, 130,000 people is a lot, again, especially when we're thinking about the potential for that number to be underreported and other things like that. 130, you could say. Yeah. You get your math skills on, you let us know what you come up with. Phones are good. I remember my teacher saying you'll never have a calculator with you all the time, but now we kind of do sometimes if you have a smartphone.
It's 2%.
2%. Thank you. You didn't need a calculator. There we go. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. 2%. Great. Collective knowledge is important. Thank you. So when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, dementia, it's an important piece, I think, to pause here to talk about what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Anyone know the difference, or has anyone heard those words used interchangeably? Shout out. Yeah? What's
My brother-in-law has been diagnosed with dementia.
Okay.
I wasn't sure about the difference.
okay?
That's one of the reasons I'm here.
One of the reasons you're here. Well, I'm glad you're here. Okay. Has anyone else ever heard those words maybe used interchangeably? Perhaps. Okay.
Dementia's like a front door, you can have vascular, you can have different, like, living.
Body, you got it.
There's different types.
Great.
Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
I have really onset, so I really don't know. For somebody who has it, I don't know at all.
You're right on. The umbrella term is exactly not only what I would say, but you'll see here this beautiful graphic looks like an umbrella. You're right on. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, and I'll just share what, do you mind sharing your name? Tricia shared that dementia is an umbrella term. That's a lot of times how we describe it. It's an umbrella term that describes a number of different symptoms that are associated with memory and thinking. There's a number of diseases that cause symptoms of dementia. So Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia. The other forms of dementia up here, or other diseases, are forms of dementia. But dementia itself is describing symptoms. It's not a disease process. Sometimes people receive a diagnosis of dementia because they may not be sure what the underlying disease process is that's causing those symptoms. They've come a long way in terms of diagnosing what form or what is causing the dementia, but there's still sometimes that they're either working on that diagnosis or have a probable diagnosis but might be calling it dementia because they're not definitive about what disease process is causing the symptoms that you're seeing. Question? You see your face.
I'm looking at that vascular dementia.
Yeah.
Way up in what?
Yep, vascular. Yep.
No, I know that.
Yep. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Sure. So vascular dementia is used to describe when there are changes in the brain due to either a large or small strokes, or vascular changes can cause some changes in the brain as well. So there may be some obstructed blood flow to certain parts of the brain. That's what we would call vascular dementia.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Having vascular disease doesn't mean that you have vascular dementia. Yeah. Doesn't mean that you have vascular dementia.
Okay, cool.
But there is some increase. There is some increase. It's okay. That's a good question. Vascular dementia alone accounts for a small percentage of forms of dementia, so about 10%, but we do often see it in combination with Alzheimer's disease. So oftentimes people may have Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. They might call that mixed dementia, but both going on at the same time. And the challenge is too that sometimes there is a major stroke that can cause one incident that can cause changes in the brain, but sometimes there are smaller strokes that people may be experiencing and not have symptoms of. And over time, that can cause some changes in the brain that can cause issues with memory and thinking, may cause some symptoms of dementia. Any questions? We're going to keep going through this, but any questions about that so far? So I'm going to go back a bit just to what is dementia. And again, here's this interferes with daily functioning, so that's that tipping point, if you will. And it's describing changes in cognition, which encompasses a number of things. Not just memory, but certainly memory, language, maybe expressive, or the ability to understand language. Changes in personality or mood. There are parts of the brain that we'll talk a little bit more about that impact our personality, have an impact on our inhibitions or lack thereof, and those may be signs of a form of dementia as well. Again, not just the memory and thinking, although that is an important piece too. There are some reversible diseases that can mimic dementia in terms of mimicking or showing symptoms of dementia. And we say reversible because the medical conditions up here can typically be treated. And so if the medical condition is treated, you may see a relief or a change in those symptoms. So, for example, oftentimes, well, brain tumor is a difficult one, right? So if it's a brain tumor that's causing those changes and there's an ability to remove the tumor, you may see a relief of symptoms from that. Not always, I'm not a neurologist, but from my understanding, not always possible to extract a tumor with that level of success. But if you were able to, you would see that change in symptoms. It's not something that's progressing within the brain from another disease. It's due to where that tumor is. We do sometimes see with hypothyroidism or dehydration, infections, other nutritional imbalances, sometimes can mimic or show themselves as symptoms of dementia, having confusion, short-term memory issues, and those may be related to or symptoms of a medical condition like the ones up here. So if you're very dehydrated, sometimes severe dehydration can cause confusion, and so there may be a thought that that's related to Alzheimer's disease, another form of dementia. When you treat the dehydration, those symptoms get better. So it's important to look into, we'll talk a bit more in a little bit about what the diagnostic process looks like, but knowing that there are some conditions that can mimic or make symptoms of Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia worse or exacerbated, you can see why going to a general practitioner to start can be a great place to get some of these medical diagnoses looked into first. Lab work and other things to see, is there another medical condition that's the cause or contributing to what's going on? Yes, sure.
I have a little story about dehydration.
Okay, sure, yeah, share away.
An elderly friend of mine, who was actually older than me,
Yeah.
in her late 80s, who lives just over the bridge. She called me and said she was feeling very bad. Her brain wasn't working well, etc., and she was sure she was getting Alzheimer's.
Sure.
She needed some help, and could I come over?
Mm-hmm.
So I went over the bridge to her house, and I took a look at her, and I said, Ruthie, when did you last drink anything? And she said, well, I think I had this was late afternoon.
Yeah.
I had half a cup of coffee for breakfast.
That was
but I
it.
haven't been thirsty. And I said, listen, if you remember, I'm saying to her,
Yeah.
there was a lady at our exercise class that we went to who was taken to the hospital from the senior
class.
center. They found that the only thing wrong with her was dehydration. But her brain wasn't working right. So I said, I'd like to see you
drink some water.
This whole bottle, like a quart and a half of water. And I said, I want to see you doing that. She did it. She hated drinking water. She did it. And almost like 5 minutes later, the clouds started to
She felt better.
And she felt better. Good. And her head was clearing up.
That's a great, two good examples of that, yes. Yeah. So what's her name?
My name's Valerie.
Valerie. So Valerie just shared, I'm not sure if everyone could hear her, but two great examples of how dehydration can show themselves as having some symptoms of confusion or short-term memory loss. Someone from across the bridge that she went over to see drank water and started immediately feeling a bit better. Similarly, someone else from an exercise class, it turned out that extreme dehydration was the cause of the symptoms as opposed to an underlying disease process like Alzheimer's disease. So thank you for sharing that, Valerie. It illuminates how we see this in real life. It's not just up here on the slides.
It's eye-boggling.
Yeah, very much so. Eye-opening. So everyone, if you have something to drink, take a sip.
I would like.
So we'll get back to this slide here that you're so kind to share the umbrella term. It's right on. So we'll talk about Alzheimer's disease a little bit more after this. The reason that we have its own separate slide is that we know Alzheimer's disease is, again, the most common form. So it accounts for about, it's a big range, but 60 to 80% forms of dementia related to Alzheimer's disease. Vascular dementia and mixed dementia we talked a bit about. Dementia with Lewy bodies, for sure you mentioned as well. That's a form of dementia that's caused by abnormal folds that form in the body called Lewy bodies, in the brain. And we typically see symptoms related to Lewy body that can show themselves in signs of really vivid hallucinations or challenges with wakefulness. So sometimes people will lose attention or almost seem as though they're passing out, and it's really maybe more related to this form of dementia. There's also some mobility challenges associated with Lewy body dementia, shuffled gait, and some stiffness in motor movement. So we see some of those symptoms related to Lewy body. And frontotemporal lobar degeneration, sometimes called FTD, that's describing the frontal lobe, which is the area of the brain where we see individuals with this form of dementia see the most, have the most significant, is the part of the brain that's the most significantly impacted by this disease. And that's the part of the brain that we know is associated with some judgment, inhibitions. So when you may see changes in personality or extreme decision-making changes, it may be that the frontal lobe is impacted, may be an indication that it's this form of dementia. We typically see as well a challenging component of FTD is that it often will, people with this diagnosis may be a bit younger than with other forms of dementia. 65, a lot more people have FTD or may be diagnosed with that. Yes?
Lewy body, isn't that very bad to have a Lewy body?
It can be really challenging. Yes, it's a difficult disease for sure.
Can they diagnose that easily?
Well, there's advanced, we'll talk a little bit about what that diagnostic process looks like, but it's a great question. Can they diagnose that easily? A lot of times to get at really seeing what the abnormal protein is that's in the brain, it requires a bit more of a brain scan to see where are the changes, what kind of abnormalities are they seeing. A lot of times too, we'll talk about this, but there's other ways of performing the diagnostic evaluation by seeing the presentation. So again, some of these symptoms are a bit more pronounced with Lewy body that you wouldn't necessarily see as pronounced in other forms of dementia, like the mobility challenges and the hallucinations. But usually a combination of things in the process can get at a probable diagnosis. Yeah, but it's challenging because there's the changes in memory and thinking for sure, which are challenging in and of themselves, and then the additional safety challenges sometimes too of the mobility challenges, potentially from falling and other things like that.
I thought you couldn't diagnose Alzheimer's unless it was after
Autopsy?
they died.
Sure.
An autopsy, right?
Yep, so we'll get back to that one. I'm gonna hold that one, Valerie. We're gonna talk about the diagnostic evaluation process and how that process has improved over time. There was a question about, can you only diagnose Alzheimer's disease definitively on an autopsy? And that used to be sort of and there are some physicians and some doctors that are still in that camp, and others that feel like we've come such a long way in terms of the diagnostic technology that we can get very close to a definitive diagnosis. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. It's a really good question. There are a number of other forms of dementia as well. These are just a few. There are many. So there are many disease processes that can cause symptoms of dementia. There's a few up here as well. Parkinson's disease, we know, is a disease that can also have impact changes in memory and thinking. Normal pressure hydrocephalus. There's also a syndrome that can be associated with prolonged or chronic excessive alcohol use that can cause changes in the brain. And those are disease processes as well that can cause changes in the brain and therefore changes in memory and thinking. A number of other forms of dementia as well. These are just a few up here.
What is that first one?
So CJD is typically what it's called. It's a rare form of dementia, very rare form. And they've seen that there have been some changes in some of the properties in the brain and the way that the nerve cells are communicating. Sometimes they've seen it associated with mad cow disease. I don't know if anyone's heard about that. There's been a link between that and this form of dementia. It's very rare, so a lot of the research in terms of what's causing it or where that connection is it's hard to come by because there's not as many people with the diagnosis to find out why.
Where was that discovered? Because the name is so foreign.
It's a good question. I'm not sure the answer to that, where it was discovered.
Yeah.
And I imagine it may have been either one person with a hyphenated name or two people.
Yeah,
That's a good question.
I know it.
Yeah. Yes.
When you give blood, they'll ask you, I don't remember how it's pronounced.
Sure.
If you have that disease, you're not allowed to give blood.
Wernicke-Korsakoff?
The
Seen
first
that.
one.
Oh, the first one, okay. So
Regularly.
maybe that
Yeah.
sort of
I've seen that all the time.
concern of,
That name, Creutzfeldt, Jacob.
like with mad cow disease, the trying to think of it, the infectious component to it. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
The Creutzfeldt that's not the one that just hits Jewish people, is it?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
Valerie, what did you just ask?
Valerie asked if there's, with this disease, more prominence in people that are Jewish.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, descent. Not to my knowledge.
There's some disease it is, and it wasn't Jewish one.
I'm not sure.
Well,
So the other component that's important to speak about is mild cognitive impairment. Has anyone heard about that? MCI, mild cognitive impairment.
Yeah.
So there may be changes or symptoms that people are experiencing that would show up on testing. So if you had if you were noticing some changes, other people might have noticed if it wasn't impacting your functioning, so it might not reach that criteria for dementia, but you're having some mild symptoms and you receive testing, and either from a brain scan or a neuropsychological exam, which we'll talk about, there were some flags that noted that there were some changes, but it wasn't significant enough to impact your daily life. They might call that mild cognitive impairment. Sometimes that plateaus, and other times that progresses and develops into Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. What's interesting about mild cognitive impairment, and you'll see here it says increases the risk of developing the disease. Research is now looking at, with more advancements in technology and being able to see brain scans, they're seeing that there are changes in the brain that may happen up to 20 years before you see symptoms. So we're starting to see is Alzheimer's, some scientists are looking at Alzheimer's disease sort of as a continuum. So you may have changes in the brain with no symptoms, and then at some point have some symptoms, they don't impact your daily life, but you might call that mild cognitive impairment, that then continues to progress and develop until the symptoms are pronounced enough that they sort of meet that criteria to be described as Alzheimer's disease. But it's a growing body of research in terms of being able to study people earlier and earlier on and look at changes in the brain without symptoms to see what is this continuum looking like, and are there intervention models that we can put in there before symptoms happen. We won't be able to hear what Steve says as well, but he talks about how he received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. It is the most common form of dementia, as we've been talking about. But he just shares his story a little bit about how he started noticing symptoms somewhat similarly to Joyce, who we didn't hear from before, but I gave a synopsis for, starting to see some changes that impacted her daily life. So we've talked a little bit about Alzheimer's disease as we've been talking about forms of dementia. We do know that Alzheimer's disease, as I said, is the most common form of dementia, affects over 5 million Americans. So this slide is slightly out of date. We know from our 2018 facts and figures it's about 5.7 million. And it's a disease that progresses, so the symptoms become more pronounced over time. There are some forms of dementia, again, those ones that might be reversible, or maybe if you have a stroke or something that impacts one area of the brain that's not progressing, it might plateau. That's different from with Alzheimer's disease. We know that the symptoms progress. It's important to think about how the brain works in the context of Alzheimer's disease, but I would say with other forms of dementia as well. We know that there are over 100 billion nerve cells in our brain, so they're neurons, and this is our brain's way of communicating. They've been able to identify that some of the changes related to Alzheimer's disease that they're seeing in the brain are related to some abnormal protein buildup called plaques and tangles. Has anyone heard of that before? A few people, a few head nods. So the plaques are what form in between the nerve cells, and the tangles are within the nerve cell body. And those abnormal proteins that build up cause the communication between cells, or the communication through cells, to become impaired. And over time, if that communication continues to be blocked or to not happen, the nerve cells can begin to wither. And that's where we start to see some areas of the brain where there are symptoms with memory. So if the hippocampus is one area where those nerve cells are having trouble communicating and there's some nerve loss there, you start to see that that's an area where the symptoms are, where you start to see symptoms or changes in memory. This next slide gets at that a little bit more. So we'll see here that there are a number of different areas of the brain that impact, that control certain areas of our functioning. We know that in the hippocampus is a major area for our memory and our language, and that's one of the areas where we see a lot of the cell death in Alzheimer's disease, which makes sense when we know that that's one of the hallmark or more prominent symptoms of the disease. Similarly, we talked a little bit more or before about FTD. That's the frontal lobe where that judgment and reasoning is taking place. So there are areas of the brain that are associated with some of the symptoms that we see. And that may, when we're talking about diagnostic process, that's where the symptoms that we're seeing give the doctor some indication about where maybe some of the changes are going on in the brain, and that can help make a diagnosis, in addition to a few other things we'll talk about too. I think it's very important here too to show what happens with Alzheimer's disease in very late stage, just to show the difference between, or where you start to see some of the changes in the brain. Again, we often associate with changes with memory, but ultimately the disease affects all parts of the brain as well. And I think it's really important to highlight this. It's a dramatic image, but it's also really important to note that it's a physical disease. So there are physical changes that are happening in the brain with Alzheimer's, with other forms of dementia as well. And I think I just like to highlight that because I think sometimes it can be challenging to understand that unless you know about the disease, or you're living with the disease, or you have a loved one with the disease. Because it's not as apparent to the eye what's going on behind, what's going on in the brain. And I think it's really important just to know that these are physical changes that are happening. We all have it's a normal human reaction to have maybe a sense of denial or limited insight into what might be going on and sort of projecting off. But it's really important to recognize that with this disease, some symptoms that you may see are due to these physical changes in the brain. There may not be within someone's control if they need a bit more help in prompting of questions. So I think that's really important just to highlight.
Does this all have to do with genes?
There's some
You
genetic.
have people like a 90 or 100 and they're sharp as a tack.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. So there are a number of risk factors. I said age is the biggest one, but it's not deterministic. And there are some genes that they've identified that increase your risk. But the genes that are deterministic, meaning if you have this gene, you will get Alzheimer's disease, are very, very rare. It's a very small percentage of people that have that form of dementia. And people that do know it, usually the onset is much younger, and it's within or very pronounced in a family. There's a research study that's going on with a family in Chile, and it's almost across the whole board that most people within the family have the disease, develop it at a younger age, even in their 40s. So that deterministic gene is very rare.
And they've had it in those families for generations.
Had it in the families for generations, correct. But there are some genes that increase your risk, just like increased age, just like some of the other risk factors that we do know can account for increased risk of developing the disease. But you're right, there are some people in very advanced age that do not have any changes in their memory and thinking. Just like there are some people with very advanced age that have no blood pressure issues or no cardiac issues, no other medical conditions either. So it's true. There are people.
Kind of doomed since you come to Earth.
Well, as we age, right? Knowing that that's one of the bigger risk factors. I hear what you're saying. You know, knowing that's a risk factor as you get older, there is an increased risk with other medical conditions too. Yeah. Yes.
Doesn't diet have a lot to play in Alzheimer's?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, does diet have a lot to play with Alzheimer's? And there's a lot of research that's looking at that now as well. We also have a program, it's called Healthy Living for Your Brain and Body. And I can share with you, I think I have our e-learning page there. It has links to our free e-learning workshops that you can dive into that one a little bit more. But what I can say is that there's research now that's looking at things like the Mediterranean diet, other lifestyle factors too, like exercise, social engagement, cognitive activity. So you're covering at least 2 of those bases today, right? I hope you're learning something new. Your brain is being stimulated, cognitively active in this conversation, and you're engaging with other people. And those have been found to be protective factors for reducing the risk of cognitive decline and for improving symptoms if someone is living with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia as well. more research to be done on those lifestyle factors. It's sort of what they're calling them in the research, but there's a lot of compelling research there that's looking at just that. One study was done in Finland that looked at those 4 components: diet, exercise, social engagement, and cognitive activity, and it was very encouraging. And now they're trying to replicate that here in the United States to see if we're seeing that again. We can speak to that a little bit more firmly. But there are lifestyle factors like that that can help contribute, lessen the risk. And one of my favorite things about the diet research is that there's a dose effect to it. So the more compliant you are with something like a Mediterranean diet is one of the ones they study. The more compliant that you are, the more your risk is reduced. But even if you're somewhat compliant, your risk is reduced. So I think that's encouraging. Being 100% compliant with a diet or any lifestyle modification can be challenging, but to know that there's still some positive effect of even being somewhat compliant, I think is encouraging for most of us. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, who being 100% compliant can be really, really challenging to sustain that over time. Yes?
There was a woman from the Alzheimer's Association.
Sure.
I just remember her middle name was Innocent. She's Italian. And she gave us a talk.
Wish I knew her.
And I'm telling you, she had the cafeteria there, or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
Prepare a 4-course meal, and it was wonderful.
Was it good?
And it was really healthy.
That's
She says
wonderful.
that it can really change the outcome of Alzheimer's by your diet.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, and you just shared that there was it at a, do you know what was this?
Nichols Village.
Nichols Village, okay, yep. So she was just sharing that they presented a meal. I think that's great. We should always pair our healthy living program with a healthy meal. I think food draws me places, so that wouldn't hurt. And then also demonstrate what we're talking about. Less processed food, healthy fats, berries, those sort of things that maybe historically we kind of know might be healthy in terms of our diets, but are a little bit more challenging to implement with regularity.
Don't forget wine.
Wine. There's research on wine as well, somewhat more related to vascular disease, but yes, that's an area of research too. I don't know if there's any research studies looking for participants in that area, but. So we talked a little bit here about risk factors, age being one of the primary risk factors. We also know that the incidence is higher in women, and there's some, it's being looked into more in terms of their other factors, but one really big contributing factor is that we know that women tend to live longer. And so there's that higher risk as you age, so we know that with women living longer, there's a higher risk there for women. Family history can increase the risk, but again, not deterministic unless there's that really less common, rare, deterministic gene at play. And we do know that there's a higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease in individuals with Down syndrome as well. Yeah. Looking at and sort of studying the why behind that, but as individuals with Down syndrome have been aging and living longer, much like the general population is living longer as well, so starting to see a higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease and studying that to find out why that may be there, but there is a high correlation. Yeah.
Like, would they be classified with having Alzheimer's, the people with the Down syndrome, like at an early age, and then they'll find out that it is really?
So it's typically that someone may be diagnosed, may have Down syndrome, and then also receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. It's typically at an earlier age than if you do not have Down syndrome. Yep, so younger onset.
Wow.
Yep, but 2 separate diagnoses.
Right.
Yes, yep. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions here? Any risk factors you've heard of or considered, concerned about?
I think it's all confusing. I really do.
It's a lot. It's a lot of information.
It is,
I
but
appreciate that.
to know when to go to your doctor if you think it, like me, navigation. Don't turn me around in my car because I won't know where I am at.
Yeah.
But I would not know when to start the visit.
Well, you are just my transition queen. I didn't pay her to do that. That's my question. Just a perfect segue into selecting a doctor. So what we talked about earlier in terms of those some of the 10 warning signs, I think that if you're starting to notice, again, any of those warning signs that are impacting your daily life, really any concern, I think it's important if you're noticing a change to to seek out some medical evaluation. It can be very helpful to get a diagnosis early, and there are things that we'll talk about that can be done in terms of intervening, but it can be even more helpful if you know what you're working with a bit more earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hard to do though. I think
that's,
it's more than just saying, I see this, I'm going to the doctor. I think we need to, we have to appreciate that that's a challenging thing to do.
yeah.
With any medical condition, particularly one that may be impacting your memory and your thinking, it can be frightening for sure, for sure.
Yeah, so if you go to the doctors and you tell them, like, you know, I forget things, I don't know where I left my keys or whatever, they just say, normal progression, getting older. Everybody has it. So how
Well,
do
there
you
are
snap
some,
out of that?
yeah. So one of our goals at the Alzheimer's Association is working on education for physicians and other healthcare providers. There is a new bill that passed recently, just this past, is it July or August, the Alzheimer's and Dementia Act, that's really aiming at ensuring that physicians have Alzheimer's disease training as part of ongoing education that they're receiving, because we do know that it's about 50% of people that have a diagnosis don't know they do. That's a big number. And some of it is that it may not be communicated. I don't necessarily think it's a malicious, we diagnose this and we're not telling, but it may be in combination with other medical diagnoses in the hospital or other conditions that are going on, that formal conversation, this is what this is the diagnosis, isn't happening as much as we'd like it to. And I think with that, it perpetuates this idea that it's maybe normal aging. If there hasn't been this training or understanding that if you're seeing these changes impact your daily life, it's not. So I think we have some, and of course, I think I might have them in my bag, some bookmarks that have the 10 warning signs. I encourage people, when I used to work on our helpline, bring that to the doctor. We'll talk a little bit more about some things that you can do to help prepare for a diagnosis, for a diagnostic evaluation. Some of these things we'll talk about I think are important, even if you're going to your general practitioner or your primary care. It's a moment in time in the doctor's office, and whatever you can do to flesh that out a bit more, provide more context, I think the better. Go ahead.
May I share?
Of course you should,
Okay.
love
So
that.
I didn't have any of the symptoms. My doctor found it. She's known me for a long time and noticed different things with me, so she started doing tests without my understanding.
Interesting.
To eliminate everything.
Yeah.
She's a specialist in dementia too, which
Okay.
I didn't know till now. And that's where she found the early onset. And I did not know it. It is shocking, but she knew what to look for. And because for me, stumbling over my words is like, you don't think that's something of a serious nature. But because I've known her for 15 years, and she noticed these subtle changes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So sometimes the doctor.
Yeah, it can go the other way. You're very right, Tricia. Thank you for sharing that.
She did not tell me until she was absolutely certain. So
Thank you for
I'm
sharing
still
that.
accepting it, but
Thank you
that's
for
okay.
sharing that. Thank
I know
you.
Milton, you know Milton?
Oh, I know
That's
Milton.
the
I
first person I called.
do. We work cubes away. I can see
he was the
him from
first
my
person
cube.
I talked to, I thought I knew him.
I'm so glad you
He's a
did.
sweetheart.
That's good. He is. Milton, one of my colleagues.
Now
He's
tell
great.
the rest of the story.
I don't know.
Yeah. Her doctor recommended us to go see a neurologist.
Okay.
So we went to see this gentleman,
Yeah.
right?
Not,
Absolute disaster.
oh, I'm sorry,
You know,
George.
here's a piece of paper, draw a circle, you know. So she's on the other side of the table, so I think you said 11 o'clock. So she drew, hand draw, put 11, right? So he's over there saying, well, you know, your
Like 2
numbers
seconds off.
just aren't quite lined up.
Oh, goodness.
Like, it's not quite at 11, it's, a little past.
That's like this clock versus that clock, right?
Yeah,
I mean, come on.
No, so in the end, he asked her a whole bunch of questions to remember this and like 5 things, and then he went back and he says, we really don't depend on the MRIs. Those really don't matter.
Okay.
And as far as he was concerned, if she didn't get lost, right,
If you
in
don't get lost,
places, you don't have it, right? End of story.
And this was a neurologist.
Yeah, my primary care was ripped. She says that is not true.
Yeah.
Not all Alzheimer's people get lost.
Yep, that's a very good point. So not everyone with Alzheimer's disease gets lost. It's not the only symptom or the only change that you might see that's associated, for sure. Thank you guys for I think you have so many such a wealth of knowledge in that story. I think there's a piece of it that you might defer to a specialist, like a neurologist, over your primary care, when in fact, there are situations where they have the wisdom of knowing you for a long time, so they might see more subtle changes or have experience with dementia that maybe you didn't know. Some of it too is, it's feeling comfortable with the doctor. I mean, this situation that you're describing with the neurologist goes beyond, I think, feeling comfortable, but there has to be this rapport and trust in what the process is looking like, the information that they're sharing with you. So it's really important and I think essential to know that if you go to a doctor that is not a good fit for a number of reasons, it's okay to go back to your primary care, go back to another neurologist. It doesn't mean that the whole process is not worth pursuing because one provider is not as helpful. Nice way to put it.
Could I add something? to that?
Sure, Valerie.
But I think one of the problems is
Yes.
once you meet somebody like that who's supposed to be an expert, and they sort of put you down somewhere, it's very deflating
To go back,
yeah.
yeah.
And it takes a lot of courage for people to take that step
For sure.
to begin with.
Yep.
And then it's on them, the onus is on them to go back to their primary care.
Mhm.
Tell them the horrible story.
Yeah.
And start all over again.
Right.
It's asking an awful
It's
lot.
asking a lot. I hear you.
Yeah.
Yep. So Valerie was just sharing, which is true. I mean, it takes courage and it's hard. I mean, it can be challenging to go take that step to go share these concerns with your primary care, additionally go to a specialist, and then to have to go back and go to someone else. And sometimes if you're hearing from a neurologist, okay, everything's fine, you might say, oh, okay, and not pursue a further diagnosis or
Because
further
you
evaluation
think that's the end of
as
it,
well. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to that. It's again, not as simple as, I know I'm seeing these changes, I'm taking that next step. This is not as linear often as that. And just another sort of plug, if you will, for the helpline, and my colleague Milton just shared, we're happy to be a resource to provide some feedback about diagnostic clinics that might be in your area, other neurologists, further discussing what selecting a doctor looks like or what the diagnostic process looks like for your individualized situation that might be more specific to you than this sort of, hopefully a little bit of a general overview today to give you a sense of things and expand maybe your thinking about this. But we can dive into that in much more detail with you one-on-one on our helpline or talking with one of our care consultants. So all really important points. I thank you guys for sharing that for sure. Sounds like you have a great internist too. Yes.
I have a friend who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He was put on medication
Yeah.
to slow the process.
Sure.
He's now at the strongest level.
Dose of it?
Is this a common thing that they do, or are just some people are not qualified to be on that? Or
Sure.
are they on the other one? What is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question's about medication. It sounds like they've been increased to what you understand is the highest dose.
As far as he can go.
As far as he can go. So I'll go back to this preparing for the visit and what the assessment looks like. I don't want to skip too far. Well, you know what, I'm gonna hold that before I get right to the end. We're going to talk a little bit about medication, and I'll remember that one about when there's an ability beyond them, if there's side effects, there's a number of things that contribute to an ability to take some of the medications that are used for Alzheimer's disease, other forms of dementia too. It's a good question. So when selecting a doctor, I think we've talked about this a little bit, can diagnose the disease with greater accuracy. So we talked about this a little bit, Valerie, good question before. We'll talk about that in the next slide when we're reviewing what some of the diagnostic, what the process is a little bit. That'll get at how they're getting closer to being more and more definitive with diagnoses. Starting with a physician who has experience in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. I think great example that sometimes that is your primary care doctor or an internist who has that experience. Other times you may need to, or the primary care may additionally refer to a neurologist, neuropsychologist. Sometimes they do that pen and paper testing that's much more extensive, can be up to 3 hours sometimes. That's kind of their specialization. But I think the key is that you want to make sure if you're consulting with primary care or a specialist that they have experience in diagnosing and treating, working with individuals with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. That kind of level of experience is really important when you're looking at this more thorough diagnostic evaluation or steps in the assessment here.
Can you just ask your doctor?
Sure, you can ask your doctor too. Yeah, do you have any experience in this?
No, you can say that to your
Sure, oh yeah,
You have,
yeah. Do you
and
have any
they'll say you
experience?
have it, right?
Yeah, and then they'll say, yes, I do. No, I'm just kidding. I think it's important to ask. It's a really important question to ask. Do you have any experience in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia? That might be a follow-up question to, this is normal aging, in a kind way, but do you have any experience with this? I'd really love to get, I'm concerned about this, and these are the reasons why, and I'd like a further evaluation. And again, we can talk you through that. We can have a dialogue about what that might really look like with your doctor if that's helpful. The steps to the assessment, so we talked a little bit about medical history. As we talked about earlier, that can be really important in terms of ruling out, is it a dietary situation, nutrition imbalance, something like that that's going on that's either the cause or contributing to the symptoms. Mental status evaluation, that's also looking at your attention to time and place. So they might want to check, is this something that's acute, that's going on? Do you know where you are, what time it is? Is it something that might be more acutely off in terms of your cognition? That's what they may be getting at there. And then there's a series of evaluations that test your memory, reasoning, and thinking. Sometimes that's called a neuropsychological exam. It can be done with a neurologist or a neuropsychologist, a bit more pen to paper testing. And there they're trying to tease out where are some of the symptoms that they're seeing, where might that correlate to changes in the brain, so that they can try to get at what form of dementia may be causing the symptoms, if any. They're also now looking at a bit more of, I think it's on here, yeah, brain scan. So it might be used to rule out stroke, but there's also been advances in brain scans as well to be able to see a bit more. MRI would show those structural changes. Are there structural changes to the brain? PET scans and more advanced PET scans may be able to pick up, are there abnormal proteins or other changes in the brain that are harder, that you can't see on MRI, but you can see on a PET scan. So with all of this kind of combination of assessment and advances in technology with scans, they're getting at, as close as there's different sides of the camp. Some doctors and scientists are still saying really and truly the only definitive way is on autopsy, and others are saying with these advancements in PET scans we can really see plaques and tangles and other hallmarks associated with the disease that would say definitively that's what's going on. There's some different camps, if you will, in terms of that, but with this extensive assessment process, it can be very close to and often say probable, if not more definitive, what may be going on. A piece I skipped over, I just want to talk about, we mentioned this a little bit, but preparing for the doctor's visit. This may be for this more thorough diagnostic evaluation or even talking to your primary care. What can you do to expand upon what your doctor is going to see in the moment in time in the doctor's office? So that might be a log of the times you've maybe noticed changes, or a loved one might be recording. You could ask them to help you in recording some of the changes that you're seeing. All medications, including over-the-counter or herbal, are important to bring as well. Could be a medication interaction that's going on that's contributing to or causing the symptoms that you're seeing. List of current and previous health problems are also important, just to give this full medical history about what's going on. And some of these things, again, you can kind of do to prepare before you go to an appointment. I think the piece here that's important to talk about, and we touched on this a little bit, but it's really important to know that when the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, there'll be a lot of emotions associated with that for the person living with the disease, family members and loved ones, and all these emotions and many more are all okay. They're all normal, they happen. I think there can be some grief associated with what's going on and some loss in independence or ability. Sometimes people that are living with the disease have shared that there's some relief or acceptance if the diagnostic process has been long or they've been noticing symptoms for a long time and unsure what it is. There can be some relief that's felt in knowing what the diagnosis is and provide some of that feedback too. I think it's just important to know that any and all of these emotions are okay and understandable, and important just to acknowledge them too. We talk about with Alzheimer's disease, going back to this idea that it's progressive, so the symptoms progress over time. At the Alzheimer's Association, we typically talk about early, mid, and late stage, but it's important to know that there are a range of individual differences with within every person. So similarly, there's a range of individual differences when someone has Alzheimer's disease. We didn't capture this, but it's triggering me to remember Joyce, whose clip we couldn't hear in the beginning. She shared that one of the early symptoms she noticed were changes in her walking, so in her gait. She was having trouble tripping, having more falls. And we typically don't see that with Alzheimer's disease. Changes in mobility often happen later on in the disease when that part of the brain that controls our motor function is impacted, but she was having those symptoms earlier on. So I think it's just an important highlight to note. You may see changes, you may see symptoms that fit kind of neatly here, but again, this idea of things being linear is not usually how life is, right? We're all human beings. There's a number of other medical conditions potentially going on, environmental and other factors that may be contributing too. So the stages can help give you a sense of what's going on, but we try not to stick too closely to them. But just to give you a sense of what some of the symptoms may look like over time. Any questions about that? Any questions so far? We can't hear from Monica Parker, but she's going to talk a little bit about the importance of planning early. So whether it's you're noticing symptoms or mild symptoms and you seek out a diagnosis, how important that can be. Or you have a very wonderful doctor who's seen you over time and picks up on things early, how essential that can be for care planning, being involved in your care planning if you're living with the disease, and also seeking out treatments or maybe getting involved in clinical trials, which a lot of people find impactful and important to do as well. Growing your support system and educating yourself about the disease. There's a number of reasons why, but we do know that planning early can be really important for everyone, for a person living with, for sure. Having that sense of involvement and being engaged in the care planning process is really important, be essential. Medication, so great question before. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. So there are a few medications that are used for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. We do know that there are not currently any medications that change the trajectory in terms of stopping the disease from progressing. One doctor that is on our medical and science committee has described some of these medications and their ability to lift the fog, so they might lessen the impact of some of the symptoms for a period of time, but at some point the medications do not continue to work. They won't stop the disease from progressing at this point. That's what we do know. Any of these medications. And some of them do have a maximum dosage that you can go up to, either for tolerance related to the individual and side effects, or in combination with other medications. And just there are max doses with medications in terms of how high up the dose they can go.
I just wonder why they put them on this. It's just prolonging it. It's just prolonging it. It seems, inevitable.
Yeah, I
totally
hear you.
Understand.
Yeah, the question is why you might take medication, and I think some people see more of an impact than others in terms of that lifting of the fog, if you will. For some people, even a year or two of lessening of symptoms or lifting the fog, it can be really important and helpful. The disease will continue to progress, but some people do see lessening of symptoms, and that can be really important, even if it's not,
The short term is just about gone, but I mean, in long term, my gosh, you can show you.
Sure.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen a change, and it was mentioned. What about? I mean, is this something? If they're on this, is it something that can be taken off, or is that illegal? Would that become a legal thing if you wanted to say? Taken off.
Stop a medication? So great question. Stopping a medication, usually in combination of consulting with a doctor about that. A healthcare proxy might be able to do that if the person can't decide for themselves if they want to stop the medication. Not the same in terms of my understanding. This category of medications are not the same in terms of other medications that do require some legal consultation and things like that in order to stop.
Yeah, just wondering. I did myself, and they're just, I mean, it was a question that came up, is this something that can legally be done, or are they weaned off it, or what would be their reasoning to want to do that?
Yeah.
Other than let it progress on, and,
yeah.
it's hard call.
It's a very hard
I got
call,
a family, so
but you're seeing it,
I'm
you're
a close
witnessing
friend,
this.
and I just think,
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's fine, I mean, other than, short, he couldn't
Yeah.
tell you minute to minute, but boy, he'll tell you everything about his life in Ireland before he came here, right down, it's amazing. It's been quite a journey to see him
See it.
do this, but, the medication, it just came up in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you stop it, why would you, and is there a weaning off process?
Yeah.
Or you don't, I'm assuming you don't stop it like that.
It's a good question, yeah, yeah. Great questions about, and thank you for sharing that.
And
And
an
it's-
individual tailspin type of thing, I don't know.
It can. I think that's why with just these medications, just like other medications, you really want to have a conversation with a doctor about stopping, weaning off, continuing on. Sometimes people just, it's a very individual decision, just like other medications are as well. You know, if you're not seeing any negative side effects, you aren't sure how much of a positive effect you're seeing, some people decide to continue. Other people say, you know, it's not worth being on, so we want to stop and wean off. My understanding would be you'd want to talk to your doctor about weaning if possible versus just stopping. But again, conversation to have with the doctor, for
Physically,
sure.
he's good as a fiddle, I
Mhm.
mean, he's no kicking the screen, and we know.
Yeah.
But I just had that question,
It's a
my
good-
own FYI.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I think some of it plays into it too is sometimes, you know, if he's not taking any other medications and it's difficult to take these medications, he's not wanting to, sometimes that, other things play into it other than just starting and stopping, I think, too. It's a good
There
question.
are a couple of other things, Tom, but I think one's warfarin, the
Mm-hmm,
other one, I think might be blood pressure, I don't know, but
yeah.
I really, he goes all the time, yeah, I just, but it is, you know, progressing. but,
Progressing.
I just wanted to know, since the subject, I never even thought about it.
Just came up, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a good
you know,
question.
Because it can be very difficult to tell, you know, that, well, maybe this medication isn't what we want it to be on.
It's like a lot of things in terms of treatment and interventions. It's for Alzheimer's disease, other forms of dementia, other medical conditions too, weighing some of the cost and benefit for an individual. Again, we know this, and it's important to highlight, we know if everyone has individual differences with or without Alzheimer's disease, other medical conditions, so many factors that play into it. So it's hard to make global statements.
Is it something they want to do just so that he will, so to speak, cross over and then just be at peace with himself, or, I don't know.
Hard to say maybe why they're, yeah, I wouldn't, yeah. But some people also, there's sometimes a combination of medications used in combination, so Aricept and Namenda are sometimes prescribed together too. It's just a combination of the medications that have been put together too. And some people see some positive effect from that as well. This is a big area of research, obviously, in terms of more medications for prevention, hopefully intervening to continue to slow or hopefully stop the disease. So this is an area of growing research, and a lot of people living with the disease have found that being involved in research studies that are looking at some of these medications can be an impactful way to be involved, just as individual a choice as deciding to or not to take medication. So it's a hard choice.
It has to be a hard choice for the
Yeah,
family, I'm sure.
hard choice, very difficult.
So what can we expect from these drugs?
Well, this is what,
Primarily, we can expect that they may improve your learning and memory a little bit. They may improve your word finding abilities.
so Dr. Peterson is just,
Could you make it louder?
She can't now. She already.
so he's sharing what we just talked about. You may see some slight changes or improvement, lifting the fog and some memory and thinking, but not indefinitely, just for a period of time. So that's what we're seeing with some of those medications now. Yes, question?
They experimented in medical marijuana.
Medical marijuana. That is a growing area of research. That and other complementary therapies, if you will. Not that I've seen in terms of the research that's definitive.
Pain and discomfort.
Pain and discomfort. I have heard that there's research related to that, to medical marijuana use. I think there's been some studies with that, most robustly related to cancer and other medical diagnoses in terms of pain. But that's an area of growing research too. Nothing definitive in terms of that being a treatment or alleviating symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, but there's research there, so time may tell. That may be a contributing factor, yeah, in terms of where they can do the study. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question. So clinical studies, I mentioned that. Another piece that's just important to highlight, it's a very individual decision to participate in a study. There's a number of reasons why people may. Sometimes, the sense that it's fueling towards treatment options is encouraging. Other times it can allow access to more advanced PET scans, for example, that aren't currently covered by insurance or other interventions. I think it's important if thinking about clinical studies is of interest, just to explore it a bit more. They're not all related to medication. Some are related to the lifestyle interventions like diet that you mentioned before. Some studies are looking at things like that, as well as scans and diagnosing early. So it's not just medication related, although those are a fair amount of research studies too. And another component that it's important that we want to make sure that we're a part of anyone's support network, their team, is the Alzheimer's Association. So we offer a number of programs, of supports, all at no cost to families. So we have our 24/7 helpline that you can call, just like the name says, 24/7. A live person will answer the phone and can talk with you about any concerns that you may be having, a question, something you read in the paper that was a new treatment or a new cause that you had a question about. You can call us anytime. Or if there's questions that come up when you're diving through this information that you're leaving with today and it spurs on another question, you can call anytime. We also set up individualized care consultations, so they're one-on-one conversations with a care consultant to dive into things a little bit more. We can set them up, conference call with family members. We typically do them by phone. We do them in person at our regional offices, but phone tends to be the most convenient since we're not always right as close by as we wish we could be. But that's a way to get some more individualized one-on-one support, again at no cost. We have education programs like this one in person and online, support groups, and our website is a wealth of information. It has details about the diagnostic process, steps to diagnosis, more information about Alzheimer's disease or those more rare forms of disease as well. So there's a lot on there. And sometimes people call our helpline because they're on the website and there's so much information that it's hard to part out which page to go to, so we can help you navigate the website as well if that's helpful. I know we covered a lot of information today, but I hope that it provided you with a bit more about memory changes, Alzheimer's disease, and other forms of dementia. I'm really grateful for all your time today, and I'm happy if there's any questions within the group or if you have questions one-on-one, happy to answer those before. Yeah?
People would have Alzheimer's at the worst stage.
Later
I don't know
stage?
what the number
Yeah.
is, 4, whatever. Why are they violent?
So sometimes the question was about more aggressive or violent behavior that can sometimes accompany Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia as the disease progresses. So it depends. As the disease progresses, it can impact different parts of the brain, including that frontal lobe. So it might change the ability to process or have insight into a behavior, maybe being a bit more of a reaction or aggressive than you might have responded with otherwise. Sometimes too, with the brain changes that can happen, there can be a misinterpretation of the environment. So there's visual changes that can happen as well. So you might see a reflection and think it's someone trying to get into your home and have a reaction to that. It might be more aggressive than you might sense in that interaction, but to the person that's seeing someone trying to break in their home, that's a somewhat normal reaction. So there's a number of things that can kind of play into what might be a more aggressive behavior that might be going on, both brain change-wise and interpretation of some of those changes.
Maybe
That makes
somebody
sense.
that was very mild, very
Mhm.
sweet, never swore,
Yeah.
all of that. When they get to that, I don't know if it's the final stage, but up there,
Mm-hmm.
they're very violent, and they're strong.
Mhm.
I mean, they could fight like the nurses are,
Yeah.
and climb up against the wall.
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, where did this come from?
Well, there can be, yeah, and I think to your point with their friend that has I think there's a number of variables at play, right? Other medical conditions or lack thereof. So someone may be very physically strong and may have a lot of changes in their thinking that are causing more aggressive, either verbal or physical behavior
Yeah.
too.
It's
So,
very
yeah.
interesting that I learned about sundowning,
Mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm.
I know when I first experienced it with this person, but, oh, what is it?
Yeah.
It was Would you explain that more? I mean, maybe so
Sure.
people aware of it. Some
Yeah,
others
anyone
aware of
aware of or heard of sundowning?
Amazing.
Yeah. There's a number of things that can play into that. Typically seeing a change or worsening of symptoms later in the day. A number of things that can contribute to that. It's typically not just one thing, but again, we're thinking about that, some visual or perception changes too. As the day gets later, there can be changes in
When I would
shadows
be leaving
and
after a visit, I would be leaving and all of a sudden this
yeah.
is gone.
As the day wears on, it can be very taxing to get through or compensate through the day, and sometimes we see a deterioration in that way.
Changing maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
It kind of threw me the first time it happened, but then it was explained to me, that the day is getting darker, they don't understand why it's happening, but they're afraid, they don't know what's going on, but it was a very interesting term from down there.
Yeah, yes, can be a common phenomenon or symptoms that you see. And something too that we talk about on the helpline a lot, are there ways to make the symptoms of that lessen environmentally, keeping the room well lit, trying to, mimic less of that dusk kind of look in the home. Sometimes it may be that there's not a lot of activity or routine going on throughout the day and looking for more to do as well. So it can be very individual as much as it is a common phenomenon too. So something else we can kind of dive into with people individually. Yes?
I noticed there's a correlation between Down syndrome.
Yes.
Now, is there one with autism?
That's a great question. Not that I'm aware of, but it's a good question. That would be a great one for my colleagues on our helpline. Yeah. Maybe more information to come in terms of autism in a correlation or other diseases in correlation as they're doing more and more studies kind of earlier on with people as well.
Because I see, and we have an autistic granddaughter, and I see similarities
interesting.
between her symptoms, if you want to use that word.
Sure.
And the Alzheimer's.
And it may be too that there are other disease processes that cause changes in memory and thinking, right? So you may see that related to autism. You may see that related to Down syndrome too. But is it the two separate diseases, or is it the symptoms that might be similar?
True.
Yeah, I think I haven't heard that, but there may be research on that I'm not aware of. It's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, Valerie.
I've got a comment rather than a question.
Okay, comment.
My sister lives in Wales.
In Wales.
Yes.
That's where your lovely accent is from.
That's where it comes from. Her husband has dementia.
Yep.
One of the big problems she has is he doesn't want anybody to know he has dementia. And he is mad as hell that my husband and I found out through our niece. Our niece told my daughter, and my daughter told us when she came to visit him in America. And he was really upset.
Yeah.
And my sisters cannot talk to me on the phone and tell me the truth of what's going on, because he's listening in on everything.
Okay.
Very controlling that way. And she says she's in charge of the X-ray department of the local hospital. The only respite she gets is when she goes to work. And then he's calling her every 15 minutes on her cell phone to ask her why isn't she home with him. And it's, I really feel for her.
Yeah, for both of them. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Valerie was just sharing about her family story. Experience with Alzheimer's disease.
So it's a disease that not only affects the person, but affects everybody around.
Sure, like many diseases, right? And I think it's true, yes. It's important to support. That's why I think this idea of support and education can't be overemphasized, how essential that can be. And sometimes that's building your care team with your doctor, friends and family. We at the Alzheimer's Association want to be a part of that, but do you want to?
When I first got diagnosed,
Question right there, you can.
and then I talked to somebody on the helpline, and said, you really need to tell people around, because when you say it out loud, you kind of can't say it.
Yeah, need entertainment.
So I told people, and it's stigma they have on Alzheimer's is very sad because they perceive a certain look to Alzheimer's. And I've had a couple of people say to me, I don't believe you have Alzheimer's because you talk fine, or you remember things, or you're this, or you're that. I says, trust me, if I didn't have it, I wouldn't make this up. And it's frustrating that I have to justify my
Sure.
And my sister won't talk to me, she hasn't talked to me in 2 years. She didn't like the gamut of emotions I had when I first got diagnosed. And handle the roller coaster ride I was on, so she's not talking to me. So there was different reactions. Just because you see one Alzheimer's disease, that's what everybody else is not.
You've seen one person with Alzheimer's disease. If you've met one person, just like if you've met one person, you've met one person.
That's
Yes.
it. Everybody goes through it differently.
Thank
But
you for
it's
sharing.
very embarrassing. And
I know he's.
but I have to say it sometimes to get over the embarrassment.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much. Yes.
My mom passed away from Alzheimer's, and towards the end, one
Yep.
of the things she lost was the ability to swallow.
Sure. Yep.
So that's.
That can happen. Yep. So as the disease progresses, we saw that picture of the brain before. It can impact all parts of the brain. So it starts in one area but can impact all parts, and that's there. Ultimately, can impact parts of the brain that control our ability to swallow and breathing, other areas as well. So that can happen. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Good question. Thank you all. I appreciate your time. If you don't mind filling out the surveys, that would be really helpful for me to know. Were there things that you were hoping I would cover that I didn't? Constructive feedback, anything like that. There's a folder up here that you can just slide those in, or you can leave them at the table and I'll collect them afterwards. Thank you so much.